The Rainy Drive, a journey beyond fog. Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're taking a slow and peaceful drive through rain-soaked roads, quiet mountain towns, and forgotten corners of American history. So get comfortable, settle into your favorite spot, and let the gentle sound of the rain and the calm rhythm of this journey help you unwind. Our story begins just before sunrise, somewhere deep in the Appalachian Mountains. A light rain has been falling for hours, and a soft blanket of fog drifts quietly through the valleys. The road ahead is nearly empty, winding gently between ancient forests and weathered wooden bridges that have stood for generations. As we travel together, we'll discover the hidden stories behind these old roads, the Native American trails that came long before the highways, the pioneer families who crossed these mountains in search of a new life, the small towns that quietly shaped America, and the timeless landscapes that have watched centuries pass in peaceful silence. So, take a slow breath, listen to the rain, and let's begin tonight's relaxing journey beyond the fog. The rain had been falling long before the first hint of daylight reached the mountains. It wasn't a thunderstorm or a heavy downpour. Instead, it was the kind of gentle rain that seemed perfectly content to fall for hours, quietly washing the leaves, the roadside stones, and the old wooden fences that had stood beside these roads for decades. Tiny drops tapped softly against the windshield, while the steady rhythm of the wipers created a comforting pattern that never seemed to hurry. Somewhere deep in the Appalachian Mountains, a quiet two-lane road stretched through endless forests. There were no crowded intersections, no towering skyscrapers, and no rush-hour traffic. Only rolling hills, ancient trees, and a ribbon of wet pavement disappearing into the silver fog. Our traveler, Ethan, had always loved mornings like this. He believed rainy roads revealed a different side of America, one that most people never noticed when the skies were bright and busy. Rain seemed to slow everything down, allowing history to rise gently from the landscape like the morning mist itself. As his station wagon climbed another gentle hill, the forest became even quieter. Tall white oaks, sugar maples, and tulip poplars stood on either side of the road, their leaves shimmering beneath thousands of tiny raindrops. Many of these trees had already been growing long before the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776. Some were already young saplings when George Washington was still a surveyor exploring the Virginia wilderness. That simple thought made the landscape feel wonderfully timeless. The Appalachian Mountains are among the oldest mountain ranges on Earth. Scientists believe they first began forming nearly 480 million years ago, long before dinosaurs ever walked the planet. Over countless ages, wind, rivers, snow, and rain slowly softened their once towering peaks into the gentle rolling ridges we see today. Every drop of rain carried away a tiny piece of stone. Every stream patiently carved another small valley. Nature never rushed. Its greatest work was completed one quiet day at a time. The fog drifted lazily across the highway ahead, wrapping each bend in soft white mist. It wasn't frightening. Instead, it felt peaceful, almost as if the mountains wished to keep their oldest stories hidden until the right traveler came along. Long before asphalt roads crossed these hills, Native American nations had already created an extensive network of trails through the wilderness. The Cherokee, the Shawnee, the Creek, the Iroquois. For countless generations, they traveled these forests with remarkable knowledge of every river crossing, mountain gap, and changing season. They understood the songs of birds, the movement of clouds, and the scent of rain long before weather forecasts ever existed. Many of America's earliest settlers survived only because native guides shared this priceless knowledge of the land. Without those ancient paths, westward travel would have been far slower, and many communities might never have been established where they are today. As Ethan rounded another gentle curve, he noticed an old wooden mile marker standing quietly beside the road. Its faded numbers were almost impossible to read. The rain had worn away decades of paint. Even so, it remained faithfully in place. Roadside markers like these once served travelers before modern GPS systems existed. Families relied on printed road maps, folding them carefully across their laps as they searched for rivers, bridges, and small towns marked with tiny black dots. Travel itself was once part of the adventure. There was no voice calmly announcing the next turn, only paper maps, careful observation, and a little patience. The rain continued its gentle song as the station wagon disappeared deeper into the peaceful American mountains. The road continued to climb, almost unnoticed, as though it had been patiently following the natural curves of the mountains for centuries. Rainwater trickled into shallow ditches beside the pavement, where smooth river stones glistened beneath the gray morning sky. Ethan eased off the accelerator. There was no reason to hurry. On quiet roads like this, every mile seemed to invite a slower pace, and every bend offered another peaceful view hidden behind the drifting fog. Far below, a narrow river wound through the valley like a silver ribbon. Its surface rippled gently beneath the falling rain, reflecting the soft light of a sun that remained hidden behind thick clouds. That river had likely witnessed more history than any living person ever could. Long before paved highways crossed these mountains, rivers were America's first great highways. Native American communities traveled them in carefully crafted canoes, carrying families, trade goods, and stories from one village to another. Later, European settlers followed many of those same waterways, transporting flour, timber, iron tools, and supplies to small frontier communities that depended on these natural routes for survival. Water shaped the nation long before railroads or interstate highways ever existed. In the 18th century, a journey of only 100 miles could take several days, sometimes even weeks, depending on the weather. Heavy rain often transformed simple dirt roads into thick mud, making horse-drawn wagons nearly impossible to move. Travel required patience. Patience became a way of life. The rain tapping gently against Ethan's windshield reminded him of an old saying his grandfather loved to repeat. America wasn't built in sunshine alone. Storms tested every traveler. Cold winters challenged every family. Long roads demanded courage. Yet generation after generation continued moving forward, carrying little more than hope and determination. As another gentle curve appeared, Ethan spotted an old covered bridge standing quietly over the river. Its weathered wooden beams looked almost untouched by time. Covered bridges became especially common during the 19th century because the roof protected heavy wooden support beams from rain and snow. Without that protection, constant moisture could rot the timber far more quickly. Many covered bridges lasted well over a century, becoming treasured landmarks in the communities they served. Today, only a small number remain across the United States, quietly preserving a piece of America's transportation history. Ethan slowed almost to a stop before crossing. Rain drummed softly across the wooden roof as his tires rolled over thick planks polished smooth by generations of wagons, horses, automobiles, and countless ordinary travelers. For just a few peaceful moments, it almost felt as though time itself had paused. On the other side of the bridge stood a small white church surrounded by towering maple trees. Its simple wooden steeple pointed into the mist. A small cemetery rested beside it, where rows of weathered stone markers leaned gently with age. Many of the names carved into those stones had nearly disappeared after decades of wind, rain, snow, and sunlight. Yet every marker represented someone who had once called these mountains home: farmers, blacksmiths, schoolteachers, railroad workers, mothers and fathers who spent their lives building quiet communities that rarely appeared in history books but helped shape the America we know today. The rain continued to fall, soft and steady, as Ethan drove onward into the fog, where another forgotten story patiently waited around the next bend. Beyond the little white church, the highway narrowed again, disappearing beneath a canopy of towering hemlocks whose branches reached toward one another like the ceiling of a quiet cathedral. The rain softened even further, becoming a gentle mist that floated through the forest instead of falling from the sky. The only sounds were the steady hum of the engine, the whisper of the tires on wet pavement, and the occasional call of a distant songbird greeting the slow arrival of morning. It was the kind of silence that felt comforting rather than empty. Ethan lowered his speed once more. In places like this, rushing almost seemed disrespectful. These mountains had watched centuries pass without ever asking the world to move faster. Long before the first automobiles climbed these winding roads, families traveled by horseback, wagon, or simply on foot. Every journey required careful planning. Travelers packed dried meat, cornmeal, blankets, lanterns, and enough supplies to last for days, because the next settlement might be many miles away. A trip that today could be completed in an afternoon might once have taken an entire week. Weather decided everything. A swollen river could delay a family for days. A heavy fog could make even familiar trails impossible to follow. And yet people continued moving west, one careful mile at a time. By the early 1800s, thousands of settlers were leaving the crowded towns along the Atlantic coast in search of fertile farmland beyond the Appalachian Mountains. They dreamed of building new homes, raising families, and creating peaceful communities where future generations could thrive. The journey was never easy. Oxen pulled heavy wagons through thick mud. Children walked beside their parents for miles each day. At night, families gathered around campfires beneath skies filled with countless stars, listening to the sounds of forests that seemed endless. Many pioneers kept journals describing these quiet evenings. Rather than writing about great battles or famous leaders, they often remembered the simple comforts: a warm meal after a rainy day, the crackling of a fire, or the comforting sound of rain tapping softly against a canvas wagon cover. History is often remembered through extraordinary events, but it is just as often built upon ordinary moments. Ethan smiled as he imagined those travelers moving along these same valleys more than 200 years ago. Perhaps someone had paused beside this very creek to refill a water bucket. Perhaps a child had skipped stones across its calm surface. Perhaps someone had looked toward these same misty hills and wondered what life would be like in the years ahead. The forest gradually opened into rolling farmland. Old red barns stood quietly among green pastures, their roofs shining beneath the rain. White fences stretched across gentle hills where horses grazed peacefully, paying little attention to the weather. Many of these family farms had remained in the same hands for generations. In rural America, it isn't uncommon to find farms that have been cared for by the same family for well over 100 years. Parents pass the land to their children, who later pass it to grandchildren, preserving traditions that quietly connect the present with the past. As Ethan continued driving, he noticed an old railroad crossing ahead. The tracks looked almost forgotten, disappearing into the fog in both directions. A century ago, railroads transformed life across the United States. Small mountain towns that had once seemed isolated suddenly became connected to distant cities. Fresh produce, newspapers, letters, and passengers could travel farther and faster than ever before. The arrival of a train was often the most exciting moment of the day. People gathered at depots not only to receive supplies, but also to hear news from places hundreds of miles away. Today, many of those quiet stations have disappeared, yet the tracks remain, stretching across the countryside like gentle reminders of another chapter in America's long journey. The rain continued its patient rhythm as Ethan crossed the rails and followed the winding road deeper into the mist, where history still seemed to linger quietly beneath every tree. The rain never seemed to stop. Instead, it settled into a gentle rhythm, as though the clouds themselves had decided there was no need to hurry. Tiny droplets gathered on the branches of towering sycamores before quietly slipping onto the forest floor below. Every leaf shimmered with silver, and every patch of moss appeared brighter beneath the soft morning light. Ethan glanced at the dashboard clock. Time felt strangely unimportant out here. The farther he traveled into the mountains, the more the modern world seemed to fade behind him. Cell phone service had disappeared miles ago, replaced by something much older and in many ways much calmer: silence. Not complete silence, of course. The forest was alive. Rain tapped against leaves. A nearby creek whispered over smooth stones. Somewhere in the distance, a wood thrush sang its beautiful flute-like melody. a sound that has echoed through eastern American forests for thousands of years. Naturalists often describe the wood thrush as one of North America's most beautiful songbirds. Its peaceful call has inspired writers, musicians, and travelers for generations, becoming part of the quiet soundtrack of America's eastern woodlands. Ethan rolled the window down just a few inches. Cool mountain air drifted inside the car. It carried the unmistakable scent of wet earth, pine needles, and rich forest soil. A fragrance many people simply call the smell of rain. Scientists even have a name for part of that familiar scent, petrichor. It is created when rain releases natural oils from plants and compounds produced by soil-dwelling microorganisms into the air. Though the word sounds modern, the experience itself is as old as rain falling on dry ground. Perhaps America's earliest inhabitants noticed that comforting aroma just as people do today. Perhaps pioneers smiled when they recognized it after weeks of dusty travel. Some things never really change. The highway gently curved around the side of a mountain, revealing a breathtaking overlook. Ethan carefully pulled into the small gravel parking area. No other vehicles were there. Only fog, only rain. Only endless layers of blue-gray mountains fatting one behind another until they disappeared into the horizon. This endless pattern inspired the name Blue Ridge Mountains. Tiny particles released by countless trees scatter sunlight in a way that gives distant ridges their famous bluish appearance, especially on warm, humid days. Standing there, Ethan could easily understand why generations of artists had tried to capture this landscape on canvas. No painting could fully describe it. No photograph could completely preserve the peaceful feeling of standing quietly above a valley wrapped in mist. The mountains seemed almost alive, not because they moved, but because they patiently changed with every passing season. Spring painted them bright green. Summer filled them with birdsong. Autumn covered them in brilliant shades of crimson, gold, and amber. Winter wrapped them beneath quiet blankets of snow. Yet through every season, the mountains remained exactly where they had always been, watching, waiting, remembering. As Ethan stood beneath the shelter of the overlook, he imagined another traveler stopping here nearly 100 years earlier. Perhaps it was a salesman driving a brand new Ford Model A. Perhaps it was a young couple taking their first vacation together. Or maybe it was a family escaping the crowded cities during the Great Depression, searching for hope somewhere beyond these peaceful hills. Every generation leaves footprints. Some are written into history books, others disappear with the rain. Yet together, they become the story of a nation. After several quiet minutes, Ethan returned to his station wagon. The engine started with its familiar gentle rumble. He smiled, adjusted his hands on the steering wheel, and continued down the rain-soaked highway, where another forgotten chapter of American history waited patiently beyond the drifting fog. The road gently descended into a wide valley where the fog rested like a soft blanket over green meadows and quiet streams. The rain had become so light that it almost seemed to float in the air rather than fall from the clouds. The windshield wipers continued their slow, steady rhythm, back and forth, back and forth. It was the kind of sound that made long drives feel timeless. Ethan noticed a weathered sign beside the road. Established 1819, just beyond it lay a small mountain town, tucked peacefully between two rolling hills. A white water tower rose above the rooftops, while brick storefronts lined a quiet main street that looked as though it had hardly changed in generations. America is filled with towns like this. Many were founded during the early 19th century, when new roads, fertile farmland, and nearby rivers encouraged families to settle beyond the original 13 states. While large cities often became the focus of history books, these smaller communities quietly supported the nation's growth through farming, craftsmanship, education, and trade. As Ethan drove slowly through town, he noticed an old courthouse standing proudly in the center square. Its clock tower still overlooked the streets. Just as it had for more than a century, courthouses were often the heart of American towns. They were places where laws were recorded, land was purchased, marriages were documented, and local decisions shaped everyday life. Around them, businesses opened, schools were built, Churches welcomed new families, and communities slowly grew stronger with each passing decade. The sidewalks were nearly empty this rainy morning. A local bakery had just opened its doors, and the warm aroma of fresh bread drifted into the cool mountain air. Across the street, a small bookstore displayed hand-painted signs in its front window, while an old-fashioned barber shop slowly rotated its familiar red, white, and blue pole. Nothing seemed rushed. Everything felt wonderfully unhurried. Before the rise of large shopping centers and online stores, main streets like this served as the center of everyday American life. Families bought groceries, visited the post office, attended community events, and caught up with neighbors while walking from one shop to the next. These simple routines created friendships that often lasted a lifetime. As Ethan reached the edge of town, he passed a beautifully restored train depot. Although no train arrived that morning, the station quietly reminded travelers of an era when railroads connected even the smallest communities to distant parts of the country. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, passenger trains carried millions of Americans across the nation. For many families, boarding a train represented adventure, opportunity, or the beginning of a completely new chapter in life. Children eagerly watched through rain-covered windows. Parents carried carefully packed suitcases. Conductors called out destinations with calm, familiar voices. Every station held countless stories of reunions, farewells, dreams, and fresh beginnings. The rain continued to whisper against the roof of Ethan's station wagon as he left the little town behind. Ahead, the highway curved once again into the forest. Towering pines welcomed him back beneath their shelter, while drifting fog slowly closed behind the car, gently hiding the peaceful town from view as though it had become another quiet memory carried by the rain. And with every mile that passed, it felt less like Ethan was simply driving through America, and more like he was traveling gently through time itself. The forest welcomed Ethan once again with a quiet stillness that felt almost sacred. Tall eastern white pines stood like silent guardians along the roadside, their trunks rising straight toward the gray sky. Raindrops slipped from one branch to another before falling softly onto a carpet of ferns that covered the forest floor. The deeper he drove, the more the modern world seemed to disappear. No flashing advertisements, no busy intersections. Only a narrow ribbon of pavement winding peacefully through one of America's oldest landscapes. Every now and then, the fog would thin for just a moment, revealing gentle hills stretching into the distance before closing again like a slow-moving curtain. It reminded Ethan that nature never reveals everything at once. Some views must be discovered patiently. Some stories unfold only to those willing to slow down. For thousands of years, these forests provided food, shelter, and medicine for the people who called them home. Native American communities understood which trees produced the strongest wood for building canoes, which plants could ease pain or fever, and which mountain springs offered the purest drinking water. Their knowledge came not from books, but from careful observation passed from one generation to the next. Long before universities were built, the forest itself served as a classroom. As the rain continued, Ethan noticed an old stone wall running beside the road. At first glance, it seemed strangely out of place. There were no houses nearby, no farms, no visible fields, only forest. Yet these forgotten stone walls are surprisingly common throughout the eastern United States. During the 18th and 19th centuries, farmers cleared countless rocks from their fields and stacked them into sturdy boundaries. Over the decades, many farms disappeared as families moved away or forests slowly reclaimed the land. The fields vanished, the barns collapsed, but the stone walls remained, quiet reminders that people had once lived, worked, and dreamed in places where trees now stood undisturbed. Nature is patient. Given enough time, it gently takes back what people leave behind. A gentle curve in the road revealed another surprise. An old red-covered mailbox stood beside a gravel driveway that disappeared into the mist. Its bright color contrasted beautifully with the soft greens and grays of the rainy morning. Mail has always played an important role in American history. Before telephones became common, letters connected families separated by hundreds or even thousands of miles. News of weddings, births, harvests, military service, and new opportunities often traveled by horseback, stagecoach, railroad, and eventually by rural mail carriers who visited even the most remote communities. Sometimes a single letter carried enough hope to brighten an entire season. Sometimes it carried heartbreaking news. Either way, people waited patiently, because every envelope represented a human connection. As Ethan continued driving, the rain grew just a little heavier. Tiny streams of water crossed the pavement before disappearing beneath the roadside grass. The windshield wipers never changed their calm rhythm, back and forth, back and forth. The peaceful sound blended with the gentle hum of the engine until it almost became a lullaby. Far ahead, barely visible through the drifting fog, Ethan noticed the outline of an old wooden inn standing beside the highway. Its porch light glowed warmly against the gray afternoon. Smoke drifted lazily from a stone chimney into the rainy sky. It looked like the kind of place where travelers had paused for generations, sharing warm meals, quiet conversations, and stories carried from distant parts of the country. Without realizing it, Ethan smiled. Perhaps the next chapter of this rainy journey wasn't waiting farther down the road. Perhaps it was waiting just beyond that welcoming front porch. Ethan guided the station wagon onto the gravel driveway, where the tires crunched softly beneath a blanket of rain-soaked stones. The old inn stood quietly among towering maple and oak trees, its wide front porch wrapped around the building like welcoming arms. A wooden sign gently swayed in the breeze. The willow creaking since 1887, the paint had faded over the years, but the letters remained easy to read. For nearly a century and a half, travelers had found shelter here from rain, snow, and the long miles that stretched across the American countryside. Ethan turned off the engine. For a brief moment, there was complete silence. Then he heard it, the steady rhythm of rain falling on the tin roof above the porch. It was a peaceful sound, the kind that encouraged people to slow down, breathe deeply, and simply listen. As he stepped onto the porch, the scent of cedar wood mixed with the cool fragrance of rain. A row of handcrafted rocking chairs faced the valley, gently moving whenever a breeze drifted through. Rocking chairs have long been a familiar sight across rural America. Throughout the 19th century, families often spent quiet evenings sitting on their front porches, watching sunsets, greeting neighbors, and sharing stories after long days of work. Before televisions and smartphones filled people's attention, the front porch served as a gathering place where conversations unfolded naturally, and time seemed to move more slowly. Ethan gently pushed open the heavy wooden door. A small brass bell above it chimed softly. Inside, the inn felt wonderfully warm. A large stone fireplace crackled gently, filling the room with the comforting scent of burning oak. Handmade quilts decorated the walls alongside framed photographs of mountain landscapes, old steam locomotives, and smiling families from generations past. The polished wooden floors creaked ever so slightly beneath his footsteps. Behind the front desk stood an elderly gentleman wearing a neatly pressed flannel shirt and suspenders. His silver hair matched the cloudy sky outside. He smiled warmly. "Looks like the rain found another traveler." Ethan returned the smile. "I don't mind the rain," the gentleman nodded. "Most folks who stop here don't." He reached beneath the counter and placed a thick leather guest book on the desk. Its pages had yellowed with age. Names filled every line. Some signatures dated back more than 100 years. During the late 19th century, many inns across America kept handwritten guest registers exactly like this one. Travelers signed their names, listed where they had come from, and often noted their next destination. Today, these old books have become valuable historical records, offering a quiet glimpse into the everyday lives of ordinary people whose journeys helped shape the country. Ethan slowly turned a few pages. One entry from 1912 caught his attention. A schoolteacher from Ohio. Another from 1928 belonged to a family traveling south in a brand new automobile. Farther along appeared the name of a young soldier who had stayed only one night in the spring of 1944 before continuing his journey. Each signature represented someone who had lived a completely different life, different dreams, different worries, different destinations. Yet for one peaceful evening, They had all rested beneath this very roof while rain quietly tapped against the windows. The innkeeper noticed Ethan studying the pages. "My grandfather used to say," he said softly, "that every traveler leaves behind a story, even if it's only their name written in ink." Outside, the rain continued its gentle song, while the fog drifted silently through the valley beyond the porch. For the first time all day, Ethan wasn't thinking about where the road would lead next. He was simply grateful for this quiet place, where history wasn't locked away inside a museum. It was still alive, one peaceful story at a time. The innkeeper closed the old guest book with great care, almost as though he were placing a treasured family heirloom back on its shelf. Outside, the rain continued its quiet conversation with the roof, while inside, the fire filled the room with a warm golden glow. "Coffee?" the innkeeper asked with a gentle smile. Ethan nodded. "That would be wonderful." Few moments later, the innkeeper returned carrying 2 heavy ceramic mugs. Steam curled slowly into the air as they settled into a pair of wooden rocking chairs beside the stone fireplace. For a little while, neither of them spoke. There was no need. Sometimes the most peaceful conversations begin with silence. The innkeeper finally looked toward one of the old photographs hanging above the mantel. It showed a muddy road filled with horse-drawn wagons. "That picture was taken in 1906, he said quietly. "Back then, this wasn't much more than a wagon road." Ethan studied the faded photograph. It was difficult to imagine. The smooth highway outside had once been little more than a narrow path through the wilderness. Before the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 created the modern interstate highway system, much of America was connected by state roads, county roads, and historic highways that followed rivers, mountain passes, and old trading routes. Traveling across the country required far more time than it does today, but many people believed the journey itself was part of the reward. Families often planned road trips weeks in advance. Cars traveled more slowly. Roadside motels, diners, and inns became familiar landmarks for generations of travelers. The innkeeper smiled. "My father used to stand on that porch and count the cars. Many come through." "Oh, not by today's standards," he chuckled softly. "But every traveler had somewhere important to be. Some were heading west to begin new jobs. Some were visiting family. Some were simply chasing the adventure of seeing America one small town at a time." In the early decades of the automobile, road trips became symbols of freedom and discovery. By the 1920s and 1930s, more American families could afford cars, making weekend drives and cross-country vacations increasingly popular. Historic roads such as the Lincoln Highway and later Route 66 inspired countless people to explore landscapes they had previously known only from maps. Rain gently streaked down the window beside them. Beyond the glass, the mountains faded into layers of soft gray mist. The innkeeper took another sip of coffee. "My grandfather always believed rainy days made people better storytellers." "Why's that?" Ethan asked. "Because rain reminds people to slow down." He smiled toward the window. "When folks stop rushing, they remember things." Ethan quietly nodded. There was wisdom in those words. Modern life often moved so quickly that entire weeks could pass without anyone noticing the changing seasons. But here, inside this quiet inn, time seemed to unfold one peaceful moment at a time. The grandfather clock standing in the corner softly chimed the hour. Its gentle tone echoed through the wooden room before fading into silence once again. For more than 300 years, grandfather clocks have measured time inside American homes, churches, and inns. Many families treasured them not simply because they kept accurate time, but because they became part of family traditions, marking birthdays, holidays, quiet evenings, and countless ordinary days that slowly became cherished memories. Ethan looked toward the rain-covered windows once more. The storm had no intention of leaving, and somehow, he hoped it wouldn't, because every drop that touched the old roof seemed to carry another forgotten story from America's past, waiting patiently to be remembered. The afternoon slipped by so gently that Ethan hardly noticed the passing hours. Outside, the rain continued to drift across the valley in long silver curtains, softening every outline of the mountains beyond. The fog rose and fell like slow ocean waves, revealing distant ridges for only a few moments before hiding them once again. The innkeeper stood and walked toward a tall bookshelf near the fireplace. Most of the shelves were filled with worn leather-bound books, old county histories, faded travel guides, and family photo albums. He carefully removed one thick volume. Its cover read simply, "The History of Willow Creek Valley." The corners of the book were worn smooth from decades of careful hands. "My grandmother helped write this," the innkeeper said with a quiet smile. "She believed every small town deserved someone to remember its story." He opened the book slowly. Inside were photographs of children standing outside a one-room schoolhouse, farmers harvesting corn by hand, church picnics beneath enormous oak trees, and families gathered around long wooden tables during harvest celebrations. None of the people were famous, yet each photograph captured a small piece of America's larger story. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, thousands of communities across the United States kept local history books just like this one. Volunteers collected photographs, newspaper clippings, family records, and personal memories so future generations would understand how their towns had grown over time. These books rarely appeared in national libraries, but for the people who lived there, they became priceless treasures. Ethan gently turned another page. There was a photograph of the valley after a heavy snowfall in the winter of 1918. Another showed the same main street during the autumn of 1935, lined with horse-drawn wagons parked beside the first automobiles. History seldom changes all at once. For many years, horses and cars shared the same roads. Old traditions quietly walked beside new inventions. Outside, a distant train whistle echoed through the rain. It was low, long, and peaceful. The innkeeper smiled before Ethan even asked. "Freight train," he said. "It still comes through every afternoon." Whistle faded into the mist. For well over a century, trains have been part of the soundscape of rural America. Long before airplanes connected distant cities, railroads carried grain from the Midwest, coal from the Appalachian Mountains, lumber from northern forests, and fresh produce from fertile valleys. They also carried letters, newspapers, musicians, teachers, and countless families searching for new beginnings. Even today, freight rail remains one of the most important parts of America's transportation system, quietly moving goods across thousands of miles of track every single day. The rain tapped gently against the windows. The fire crackled softly. Neither sound competed with the other. Instead, they blended together into a peaceful rhythm that made the old and feel wonderfully timeless. The innkeeper closed the history book and looked toward the window. "My grandfather always said the mountains never forget." Ethan looked outside. The mist drifted slowly between the trees. "What did he mean by that?" The old man smiled. "People come and go. Roads change. Trains arrive. Businesses open. Businesses close. The mountains." He paused for just a moment. "They quietly remember every generation that has ever called this place home." Ethan sat in silence, listening to the rain as it gently washed across the valley. For the first time during his journey, he realized that history wasn't only found in famous battles or grand monuments. Sometimes, it lived inside an old guest book, a faded photograph, a weathered railroad whistle, or the quiet voice of an innkeeper sharing memories beside a warm fire while rain whispered softly against the windows. As the afternoon slowly gave way to evening, the rain became even gentler, almost as if the clouds themselves were growing tired. A soft gray light settled over Willow Creek Valley, and the windows of the old inn reflected the warm glow of the fireplace. The innkeeper rose from his chair and walked toward the front porch. Ethan followed. The air outside was cool and wonderfully fresh. Tiny droplets clung to the wooden railing, while the rocking chairs swayed ever so slightly in the mountain breeze. The valley below seemed wrapped in a blanket of mist. Not a single sound disturbed the peaceful evening except the distant murmur of Willow Creek flowing over smooth stones. The innkeeper leaned against one of the porch posts. "When I was a little boy," he began, "my grandmother used to bring me out here every evening after it rained." Ethan listened quietly, point across the valley and tell me to look carefully. What was I supposed to see? The old man smiled. Nothing. Ethan looked surprised. Nothing. That's right. Believe people spend so much time looking for something extraordinary that they forget how beautiful ordinary moments really are. A few peaceful minutes. Neither of them spoke. The rain drifted quietly across the distant hills. Somewhere far away, a church bell rang 6 slow chimes before fading into the evening air. Across rural America, church bells have marked the rhythm of daily life for generations. Long before radios, smartphones, or digital clocks, their familiar sound announced the passing hours, welcomed neighbors to Sunday worship, celebrated weddings, and honored those who had passed away. For many small towns, the church bell became a comforting reminder that no matter how much the world changed, some traditions remained beautifully constant. Ethan closed his eyes for just a moment. He could almost imagine this very porch 100 years earlier. A family returning from town in a horse-drawn wagon. Children laughing as they jumped over puddles after a summer rain. A grandmother rocking gently in one of these same chairs while knitting beneath the porch roof. History rarely disappears. It simply settles into places willing to remember. The innkeeper pointed toward a large maple tree standing beside the driveway. My father planted that tree in the spring of 1952. Its branches now stretched gracefully over the entire front yard. It was only about 3 feet tall back then. Trees often become living calendars. Each ring hidden inside the trunk marks another passing year, another spring, another summer, another autumn, another quiet winter. While people celebrate birthdays with candles and photographs, trees quietly record the same passage of time beneath their bark. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves. Tiny drops of rain fell from the branches like scattered crystals. The scent of damp earth drifted across the porch once again. Scientists know that forests release natural compounds called phytoncides, aromatic oils produced by trees that contribute to the fresh woodland, scent many people find deeply relaxing. Spending time in forests has long been associated with feelings of calm, making mountain landscapes like these especially peaceful places to slow down and simply breathe. The first lights began appearing in the distant valley below, one farmhouse, then another. Soon a handful of warm yellow windows glowed softly through the mist, like tiny lanterns scattered across the countryside. From high above, they looked like quiet reminders that families were gathering for dinner, sharing stories, reading books, or simply enjoying another peaceful rainy evening together. Ethan smiled. His journey had taken him many miles from home, yet standing on the porch of an old mountain inn, surrounded by rain, fog, and history, he felt something wonderfully familiar. Not because he had been here before, but because some places have a timeless way of making every traveler feel as though they belong. Darkness arrived slowly over the valley. There was no sudden change, only the gentle fading of daylight as the blue-gray mountains melted into the evening sky. The rain continued without interruption, now little more than a delicate whisper against the roof of the inn. One by one, small porch lamps flickered to life. Their warm amber glow reflected softly on the rain-soaked wooden floorboards, creating tiny pools of light that danced with every falling raindrop. Ethan remained in the rocking chair. There was something deeply comforting about watching the rain without needing to be anywhere else. The innkeeper disappeared inside for a few minutes before returning with an old brass lantern. He placed it gently on the porch table. "We don't really need this anymore," he said with a smile. "The electricity works just fine." He looked at the lantern for a moment. "But I still light it every rainy evening." With careful hands, he turned the small knob. A soft golden flame appeared inside the glass. Its gentle light reminded Ethan how different life had once been. Before electric lights reached much of rural America, evenings were illuminated by candles, oil lamps, and lanterns. Families planned their days around the setting sun, reading, sewing, writing letters, or telling stories together beneath the warm glow of a single flame. When the Rural Electrification Administration expanded electrical service during the 1930s and 1940s, it transformed everyday life for millions of Americans living in the countryside, bringing light to homes that had relied on lanterns for generations. Yet somehow, the lantern felt warmer, more personal. Its small flame seemed to belong perfectly in the quiet evening. The innkeeper leaned back in his chair. My grandmother never hurried bedtime. Ethan smiled. Neither did mine. The old man nodded. She believed sleep should arrive like a gentle visitor, never chased, never forced, simply welcomed. The words settled peacefully into the evening air. Beyond the porch, fireflies began appearing above the wet grass. Their tiny lights blinked slowly among the drifting mist. For countless generations, children across America have spent warm summer evenings watching fireflies rise from fields and gardens. Scientists still study exactly how these remarkable insects coordinate their flashes, but for many families, they remain one of the most magical symbols of peaceful country nights. The valley had become almost completely quiet. The distant creek still flowed, the rain still whispered, leaves still rustled whenever a light breeze wandered through the trees. Everything else seemed perfectly still. Ethan looked toward the mountains one last time. Although hidden behind darkness and fog, he knew they were still there, patient, unmoving, exactly as they had been for countless generations. Those mountains had witnessed Native American villages, frontier cabins, wagon trains, steam locomotives, the first automobiles, and now modern travelers quietly passing through. Empires changed, technology advanced, roads improved. Yet the mountains continued their silent watch, asking for nothing except time. The innkeeper gently closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the rain. "It always sounds the same," he whispered. "Rain," he smiled. "Yes. My grandfather heard this sound. My father heard it my entire life. Long after we're gone," he glanced toward the dark valley, "someone else will sit on this porch listening to this very same rain." Ethan didn't answer, he simply listened, because sometimes history isn't found in grand speeches or famous landmarks. Sometimes history is carried quietly from one generation to the next, one rainy evening, one peaceful porch, and one timeless story at a time. The lantern burned steadily as the evening grew deeper. Its warm glow reached only a few feet beyond the porch, leaving the rest of the valley wrapped in soft darkness. The rain had settled into a slow, comforting rhythm, and the fog drifted silently between the trees like a quiet river of clouds. Ethan had lost track of time. The clock inside the inn had chimed several times, yet the hours no longer seemed important. Some places have a way of making time feel gentle. This was one of them. The innkeeper stood and motioned toward the edge of the porch. "Come here," he said softly. Ethan walked beside him. Far across the valley, a single freight train emerged from the darkness. Its bright headlight cut slowly through the mist before disappearing behind another wooded hill. Only the soft rumble remained. "It still amazes me," the innkeeper whispered. "What does?" "That these tracks have carried people through these mountains for more than 100 years. America's great railroad era changed the rhythm of everyday life. During the late 19th century, trains connected remote mountain towns with growing cities hundreds of miles away. Fresh milk reached markets before sunrise. Newspapers delivered yesterday's headlines to communities that had once waited weeks for news. Families traveled farther than their grandparents could ever have imagined, while small businesses found customers across entire states. Railroads did more than move people, they connected lives. The train whistle echoed once more, long, gentle, almost melancholy. Then it disappeared into the rainy night. For several quiet moments, neither man spoke. The silence felt complete, not empty, simply peaceful. Above the clouds, countless stars were hidden from view. Yet Ethan knew they were there, just as they had been for every traveler who had ever looked toward these same mountains. Native hunters navigating by moonlight, colonial explorers crossing unfamiliar valleys, Civil War messengers riding through difficult terrain, railroad engineers watching signals beside the tracks, modern travelers following quiet highways through the rain. Every generation had looked toward the same sky. Every generation had wondered what waited beyond the next hill. The innkeeper quietly smiled. "My grandmother used to tell me something every rainy evening." "What was that?" she'd say. He paused, listening to the rain. "Never believe history only lives inside museums." Ethan waited. "It lives in ordinary places, in old front porches, in worn wooden floors, in forgotten bridges, in family recipes, in letters tucked away inside drawers. Sometimes He looked toward the dark road beyond the inn. It simply waits beside a quiet highway until someone slows down enough to notice. Those words lingered in Ethan's thoughts. How many remarkable stories had he driven past during his life without ever realizing they were there? How many small towns had quietly shaped America without appearing in school textbooks? How many families had built peaceful lives in valleys hidden beyond the fog? History wasn't only the story of presidents, inventors, or famous battles. It was also the story of teachers who inspired children, farmers who cared for the same fields for generations, railroad workers who kept trains moving through every season, storekeepers who greeted neighbors by name, and travelers who paused long enough to appreciate the beauty of an ordinary rainy evening. The lantern flame flickered gently as a cool breeze crossed the porch. Somewhere beyond the mist, an owl called softly from the forest. The sound echoed once, then faded into the quiet Appalachian night. Ethan smiled. Tomorrow the road would continue. New valleys would appear. New stories would quietly reveal themselves. But tonight, the rain, the mountains, and the old inn were exactly where they needed to be. Later that evening, after the last of the coffee had been poured and the lantern burned a little lower, the innkeeper unlocked a small wooden cabinet tucked beneath the staircase. Inside were dozens of carefully arranged objects, not expensive treasures, not rare artifacts, simply ordinary things that had quietly survived the passing years. An old railroad pocket watch, a pair of worn leather gloves, a faded postcard, a hand-carved wooden whistle, a brass room key from a hotel that no longer existed. Ethan stepped closer. Each item seemed to hold a story waiting to be told. The innkeeper picked up the pocket watch first. "It belonged to my great-grandfather," he said. "He worked on the railroad for nearly 40 years." He gently opened its polished cover. The hands had stopped many years ago, yet somehow it still felt alive. During the great age of American railroads, keeping accurate time was more than a matter of convenience. Train schedules depended on precision. Railroad employees carried reliable pocket watches so trains traveling in opposite directions could safely share the same tracks. In fact, the railroad industry helped establish standardized time zones across the United States in 1883, making travel and communication far more organized than ever before. Before that, many towns simply set their clocks according to the position of the sun. Noon in one community could be several minutes different from noon in another. For travelers crossing long distances, that often created confusion. Standard time quietly brought order to a rapidly growing nation. The innkeeper carefully returned the watch to its place. Next, he lifted the faded postcard. Its edges had become soft with age. The picture showed the very same in standing beneath bright autumn trees nearly 100 years earlier. A handwritten message covered the back. It read, "The mountains are peaceful beyond words. I wish you could see the morning fog from the front porch." There was no signature, only a date, October 14, 1931. The innkeeper smiled. "We never discovered who wrote it. We kept it anyway." Postcards became incredibly popular in the early 20th century. Before long-distance phone calls were common and affordable, travelers often mailed short notes home describing the places they had visited. Many families collected these colorful cards inside albums, creating small snapshots of America's changing landscapes one journey at a time. Ethan imagined the unknown traveler carefully choosing those few simple words nearly a century ago. Perhaps they had stood on this very porch. Perhaps they had listened to rain tapping against the same roof. Perhaps they had watched the same fog drifting across the valley. Some experiences remain timeless. Outside, the rain quietly continued. It showed no sign of ending. Instead, it wrapped the mountains in a peaceful stillness that made the entire valley feel wonderfully removed from the busy world beyond. The innkeeper opened the front door for a moment. Cool evening air drifted inside. The scent of wet pine, fresh earth, and distant wildflowers filled the room. "Every season smells different," he said softly. "Spring carries blooming dogwoods. Summer brings fresh-cut hay. Autumn smells like fallen leaves. And rainy evenings," he closed his eyes for a brief moment, "they smell like memory." Ethan wasn't sure whether that could possibly be true, yet somehow, Standing in the quiet warmth of the old inn, listening to the gentle rain beyond the windows, it felt exactly right, because memories, much like rain, often arrive quietly, one drop, one story, and one peaceful moment at a time. Night settled completely over Willow Creek Valley. The rain had become so gentle that it was difficult to tell where the falling droplets ended and the drifting fog began. Beyond the windows of the inn, the mountains had disappeared into darkness, leaving only the occasional glow of a farmhouse light in the distance. Inside, the fireplace continued to burn with a slow, steady warmth. The dancing flames reflected across the polished wooden floor, just as they had for generations of travelers who had found shelter here on quiet, rainy nights. The innkeeper reached for another photograph resting on the mantel. Unlike the others, this one was in color. It showed a family standing proudly beside a large station wagon in the summer of 1964. Children smiled at the camera, while their parents leaned comfortably against the car. A canvas suitcase rested on the roof. "That was my family," the innkeeper said with a gentle laugh. "My father believed every summer deserved at least one long drive." Ethan smiled. "Where did you go?" "Oh, everywhere. Blue Ridge Parkway, Great Smoky Mountains, Shenandoah. Sometimes we never had a destination, simply followed the road." That simple idea reminded Ethan of a special chapter in American history. After World War II, family road trips became one of the country's favorite traditions. As highways improved and more families owned automobiles, parents loaded their children into station wagons, packed picnic baskets, unfolded paper maps, and spent summer vacations exploring national parks, mountain roads, lakes, and historic towns. For many Americans, the journey itself became more important than reaching the destination. Children counted license plates from different states. Parents stopped at roadside diners for homemade pie. Families collected postcards, pressed wildflowers between the pages of books, and filled photo albums with memories that would be shared for decades. Those simple vacations helped create a lasting tradition of exploring America's landscapes one peaceful mile at a time. The innkeeper carefully placed the photograph back on the mantel. "My grandchildren still visit every summer," he said. "They don't remember every place we drive. They always remember the rainy days." Ethan looked toward the window. Why did rainy memories stay with people so clearly? Perhaps because rain naturally slows life down. Perhaps because quiet moments leave deeper footprints than busy ones. Or perhaps because the sound of rain has comforted human beings for thousands of years, no matter where they lived. Outside, the creek flowed gently beneath the old covered bridge Ethan had crossed earlier that morning. For more than a century, that bridge had carried wagons, horses, Model Ts, family station wagons, pickup trucks, and modern travelers. Generations changed, vehicles changed, but the bridge continued welcoming everyone who crossed it. History often survives through remarkable people. Sometimes it survives through remarkable places. The grandfather clock quietly chimed once again. Its slow notes echoed through the inn before fading into silence. The innkeeper smiled toward the sound. "My father used to say something every time that clock chimed." "What was it?" He looked thoughtfully into the fire. "Another hour has become history." Ethan let those words settle gently in his mind. Every peaceful conversation, every rainy drive, every family meal, every quiet evening on a front porch, given enough time. Even the simplest moments become part of history. Outside, the rain continued its endless lullaby across the Appalachian Mountains. Inside, the warmth of the fire, the scent of old wood, and the quiet stories of generations past blended together into something timeless. And without either of them realizing it, the journey beyond the fog had become far more than a drive through the mountains. It had become a slow and peaceful journey through the heart of America's memories. Just before dawn, Ethan awoke to a familiar sound, rain. It had fallen gently through the entire night, never becoming heavy, never demanding attention, only quietly accompanying the passing hours like an old friend. For a few moments, he remained perfectly still beneath the warm quilt. The room was peaceful. The old wooden walls creaked softly as the cool mountain air settled outside. Somewhere below, the fireplace still glowed with a few fading embers, and the scent of seasoned oak lingered gently throughout the inn. He walked to the window. The valley beyond had disappeared beneath a blanket of thick morning fog. Only the tops of the tallest trees reached above the mist, looking almost like small islands floating on a quiet sea. Every season offers its own kind of beauty in the Appalachian Mountains, but foggy mornings have long been among their most unforgettable sights. Warm, moisture-rich air rises from the valleys and cools as it meets the mountain slopes, creating the soft blankets of mist that often linger until the morning sun grows stronger. From high overlooks, the valleys can resemble gentle waves rolling across an endless ocean. No wonder early settlers often described these mountains with a sense of wonder. The world outside looked untouched, almost timeless. Ethan quietly dressed and made his way downstairs. The inn was already awake. The comforting aroma of freshly baked biscuits drifted from the kitchen, blending with the rich scent of coffee that had just finished brewing. The innkeeper was standing near the stove, carefully flipping pancakes on an old cast-iron griddle. "Good morning," he said with a smile. "Looks like the rain decided to stay another day." "I was hopping at wood," Ethan replied. The innkeeper laughed softly. "Sound like my grandmother." They carried their breakfast onto the front porch. Steam rose from their coffee mugs as cool morning air drifted across the valley. The rocking chairs moved gently beneath them. American breakfasts have changed over the centuries, but in many rural communities, simple morning meals remained remarkably consistent. Fresh biscuits, homemade preserves, eggs, oatmeal, bacon, and locally roasted coffee often brought families together before a long day's work. These breakfasts weren't elaborate. They were comforting, filling, and deeply connected to the rhythms of everyday life. As Ethan spread a spoonful of blackberry jam onto a warm biscuit, he noticed a narrow dirt road disappearing into the forest beyond the inn. "Where does that road go?" he asked. The innkeeper followed his gaze. "Nowhere important." Then he smiled, which usually means it's worth exploring. Road had once connected several small farming communities before newer highways were built farther south. Most travelers no longer noticed it. Nature had slowly begun reclaiming its edges. Wildflowers lined both sides. Tall grasses bent beneath the weight of the rain. Young maple trees leaned gently over the path as though welcoming anyone curious enough to wander beyond the pavement. Across the United States, thousands of miles of old roads have quietly faded from everyday use. Some were replaced by larger highways. Others disappeared as towns changed or populations moved elsewhere. Yet many remain, hidden beneath forests or winding peacefully through countryside, preserving the memory of earlier generations who traveled them by foot, horseback, wagon, or the earliest automobiles. The innkeeper looked toward the forgotten road with quiet affection. "My grandfather called roads like that memory lanes, because they lead to memories," he nodded. "And because they remind us that not every important place appears on a modern map." Ethan smiled into his coffee. Perhaps the old man was right. Sometimes the greatest discoveries aren't found by chasing famous landmarks. Sometimes they begin by taking the quiet road that everyone else has forgotten. The rain continued to fall softly beyond the porch roof, inviting another peaceful chapter of the journey to unfold. After breakfast, Ethan thanked the innkeeper, placed his overnight bag back into the station wagon, and stood for a moment beneath the porch roof. The farther Ethan traveled along Old Mountain Road, the narrower it became. The pavement gradually gave way to a smooth gravel surface, where tiny stones crunched gently beneath the tires. Rainwater collected in shallow puddles that reflected the towering trees above like little mirrors scattered across the countryside. The forest seemed untouched. Towering chestnut oaks, hickories, and black walnuts stretched high into the mist, while wild ferns covered the ground beneath them. Every branch carried hundreds of sparkling raindrops, each one catching the soft morning light that filtered through the clouds. It was easy to imagine another century, to picture a horse and wagon appearing around the next bend, to hear the distant sound of iron horseshoes striking damp earth instead of rubber tires rolling across gravel. These mountains have always invited the imagination. Ethan rounded another gentle curve and noticed something unexpected. Half hidden beneath climbing, ivy stood the remains of an old stone mill. Its massive water wheel had long since stopped turning. The wooden roof had partially collapsed, yet the thick stone walls still stood proudly beside the creek. The innkeeper had mentioned forgotten places. Perhaps this was one of them. Ethan parked beneath a towering sycamore and stepped outside. The rain felt cool against his jacket but never uncomfortable. A narrow footpath led toward the mill, where wildflowers had quietly claimed the old entrance. More than 200 years ago, gristmills like this one were essential to life in rural America. Farmers brought corn, wheat, and rye to be ground into flour, often traveling many miles by wagon. The mill became more than a workplace. It was a gathering place where neighbors exchanged news, shared advice, and strengthened the bonds of their community. In many small towns, the mill was as important as the church, the schoolhouse, or the general store. Ethan rested one hand against the cool stone wall. The rocks felt solid despite their age. Generation after generation had carefully placed them here by hand. No heavy machinery, no modern equipment, only patience, skill, and determination. The creek still flowed beside the building exactly as it always had. Water rushed gently over smooth stones before disappearing beneath the remains of the old wheel. Nature had never stopped, only the people had moved on. A small wooden plaque stood quietly near the entrance. The words had faded, but Ethan could still read them. Cedar Run Mill, built 1824, restored by local volunteers. 1987, he smiled. Across the United States, thousands of volunteers work quietly to preserve local history. Historical societies, neighborhood organizations, and dedicated families restore old schools, mills, depots, churches, and farmhouses, not because they expect fame, but because they believe future generations deserve the chance to experience these places. History survives because ordinary people choose to care for it. The rain continued falling softly as Ethan sat on a smooth stone overlooking the creek. For several peaceful minutes, he simply listened. The flowing water, the distant call of a Carolina wren, the gentle rustling of leaves. There was something deeply comforting about knowing that this little stream had been singing the same quiet song for centuries, long before the United States became a nation, before the first wagons crossed these mountains, before railroads, automobiles, or telephones. This creek had already been flowing patiently toward the valley below. Ethan took one final look at the old mill before returning to his station wagon. As the engine started once again, he realized that every forgotten building along this rainy road carried more than weathered stones and aging timber. It carried the quiet memories of countless ordinary lives that, together, helped build the story of America. Leaving Cedar Run Mill behind, Ethan continued along the quiet gravel road as the morning drifted peacefully toward midday. The rain softened once again into a light mist, hanging beneath the branches like a delicate veil. Every few miles, the forest opened just enough to reveal rolling pastures, weathered barns, and small farmhouses resting quietly among fields of green. There was a comforting rhythm to the landscape: forest, creek, meadow, bridge, forest again. It was a rhythm that had remained almost unchanged for generations. Before long, Ethan noticed another wooden sign standing beside the road. Its letters were hand-painted in white. Pleasant Ridge School, a half-mile curious. He followed the narrow lane until a small white building appeared on the crest of a grassy hill. It was a one-room schoolhouse. A simple bell tower rose above the entrance, while an American flag fluttered gently in the cool breeze. The building looked lovingly cared for, even though no children had studied there for many decades. Ethan stepped out of the car. The rain had nearly stopped, leaving only tiny drops clinging to the grass. The air smelled fresh, carrying the scent of wildflowers and damp earth. A bronze plaque near the front door explained the building's history. Built in 1879, served the children of Pleasant Ridge until 1948. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, one-room schoolhouses were common across rural America. A single teacher often instructed students of every age, from young children learning the alphabet to older teenagers studying mathematics, geography, and American history. Lessons were simple, books were shared. Older students frequently helped younger ones. Education was not measured by technology or large classrooms, but by curiosity, discipline, and a strong sense of community. Ethan gently pushed open the restored front door. Inside, sunlight filtered through tall windows, illuminating rows of wooden desks worn smooth by countless small hands. A cast-iron stove stood quietly near the center of the room. Before central heating became common, that single stove kept children warm during long Appalachian winters. Students sometimes arrived early to help carry firewood, while teachers lit the morning fire before lessons began. Above the chalkboard hung a beautifully preserved American flag. Beside it rested an old globe. Its colors had faded, yet the continents remained clearly visible. The United States shown on that globe looked noticeably different from today's maps. Several states were still young. Alaska and Hawaii were not yet represented. Maps, like history itself, continued to change. Ethan slowly walked between the desks. He imagined children removing their wet coats after walking through rain or snow. He imagined the teacher ringing the bell to begin another day of lessons. Perhaps one student dreamed of becoming a doctor, another hoped to build railroads, another simply wanted to help on the family farm. None of them could possibly know how the future would unfold. Yet every lesson learned inside this little room quietly shaped the communities around them. Education has always been one of America's greatest investments, not only in knowledge, but in opportunity. Across generations, even the smallest rural schools opened doors to larger dreams, proving that remarkable futures could begin in the most ordinary places. Before leaving, Ethan paused beside the doorway and looked back one last time. The classroom was empty, yet somehow, it didn't feel lonely. It felt full of laughter, full of questions, full of quiet determination. The old bell above the roof stirred gently in the breeze, producing the faintest, most peaceful chime. It sounded almost like the mountains themselves, remembering another ordinary school day from long ago. With a grateful smile, Ethan stepped back into the cool mountain air, climbed into his station wagon, and continued along the rain-washed road, knowing that somewhere beyond the next gentle hill, another forgotten chapter of America's story was patiently waiting. The schoolhouse slowly disappeared behind a curtain of trees as Ethan continued along Old Mountain Road. The rain returned once again, gentle and unhurried, settling softly across the fields and forests as though it had no intention of leaving the mountains. Ethan didn't mind. By now, the sound of rain had become part of the journey itself. A few miles farther on, the road climbed toward one of the highest ridges in the valley. The station wagon worked steadily up the long incline while clouds drifted lazily through the treetops. Every now and then, a break in the fog revealed breathtaking views stretching for miles across the Blue Ridge Mountains. Layer after layer of rounded peaks faded into the distance, each one slightly lighter than the last, until the horizon became almost impossible to distinguish from the sky. There was a reason generations of painters, photographers, and writers had fallen in love with these mountains. They never looked exactly the same twice. Rain changed them, morning light changed them, autumn colors transformed them. Winter snow gave them an entirely different personality. Yet beneath every season, they remained the same ancient mountains that had quietly watched the story of America unfold. Near the top of the ridge, Ethan noticed a small stone monument standing beside the road. It wasn't large, perhaps only 4 feet tall, simple, weathered. A bronze plaque was attached to its front. It read, "In memory of the mountain surveyors who mapped these valleys 1836-1842, Ethan stepped out into the cool mist. Before railroads, before highways, and long before satellites or GPS, surveyors played an essential role in America's growth. Carrying little more than compasses, chains, notebooks, and remarkable determination, they crossed forests, climbed mountains, and measured rivers to create some of the nation's earliest accurate maps. Their work required extraordinary patience. Dense forests blocked distant views. Rain soaked their equipment. Steep slopes slowed every mile. Yet they continued carefully recording elevations, distances, and natural landmarks that would later guide settlers, engineers, and future generations. Standing beside the monument, Ethan imagined a small surveying party making its way through these very woods nearly 200 years earlier, heavy boots sinking into wet leaves, leather journals tucked safely beneath oilcloth, brass compasses catching the morning light whenever the clouds briefly parted. There were no paved roads then, only determination, and the quiet hope that careful work today would make tomorrow's journeys a little easier. The rain gently tapped against the leaves overhead. Not much had changed. The forest still whispered. The mountains still stood patiently. Only the travelers were different. As Ethan returned to the station wagon, he unfolded the old paper map the innkeeper had given him. Near the bottom corner, someone had written a sentence in neat blue ink. The slow road always tells the better story. There was no signature. Perhaps the innkeeper had written it, perhaps his grandfather, perhaps someone else entirely. It didn't really matter. The words felt true. Modern highways carry people quickly from one destination to another, but the old roads, they invite people to notice. A forgotten monument, a quiet stream, an abandoned mill, a one-room schoolhouse, a story that would have remained hidden if the journey had been rushed. Ethan carefully folded the map and placed it back on the passenger seat. Ahead, the rain drifted gently across another winding curve, disappearing into the soft gray fog. He smiled. There was no need to wonder what waited beyond it. Whatever it was, the mountains had been patiently waiting for someone to discover it for a very long time. The road curved gently around the mountainside before descending into another quiet valley. The rain had almost stopped now, leaving only tiny droplets clinging to the leaves. Low clouds drifted slowly through the trees, and shafts of pale sunlight occasionally slipped through the mist, painting soft patches of gold across the wet fields. It felt as though the mountains were slowly waking. Ethan noticed a narrow dirt lane branching away from Old Mountain Road. At its entrance stood a weathered wooden sign. Maple Hollow Cemetery, founded 1808. Curiosity gently guided him down the lane. The road was lined with towering sugar maples whose branches formed a peaceful arch overhead. Fallen leaves from seasons long past had become part of the rich forest soil, while patches of moss covered old stone walls on either side. At the end of the lane stood a small iron gate. Beyond it rested one of the oldest cemeteries Ethan had ever seen. There were no grand monuments, no towering statues. Only simple stone markers scattered across a quiet hillside overlooking the valley. The rain had washed every stone clean. Many of the oldest inscriptions had faded almost beyond recognition, softened by more than 2 centuries of wind, rain, snow, and changing seasons. Ethan walked slowly among them. Some markers belonged to children, others to farmers, teachers, ministers, blacksmiths, and veterans. Most lived ordinary lives. Yet ordinary lives are what quietly build a nation. Across the United States, historic rural cemeteries serve as peaceful records of local history. Long before digital archives or official databases existed, gravestones preserved names, family connections, dates, and small pieces of community history. Historians often learn about forgotten towns by carefully studying these quiet places where generations rest side by side. Near the center of the cemetery stood an enormous white oak tree. Its trunk was so wide that it would have taken several people holding hands to surround it completely. The tree had likely been standing here long before the cemetery itself was established. Perhaps it had offered shade to the very first funeral held on this hillside. Perhaps it had quietly witnessed every season since. Trees often become silent historians. They ask for no recognition, yet they remember every passing year. A small American flag rested beside one modest headstone. The inscription simply read, Private Samuel Carter War of 18,121,789, 1,856. Ethan paused for a long moment. The War of 1812 is sometimes called America's Second War of Independence. Though often overshadowed by the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, it helped strengthen the young nation's identity and confirmed that the United States would remain an independent country. Many veterans returned home after the conflict to farm, raise families, open businesses, and quietly contribute to the growth of their communities. Samuel Carter had likely done exactly that. History remembered the war, But this quiet hillside remembered the man. A gentle breeze stirred the branches overhead. Hundreds of tiny raindrops fell from the leaves, sparkling briefly before disappearing into the grass. The cemetery felt peaceful, not sad, simply timeless. It reminded Ethan that history is not only measured by great events, it is also measured by generations who loved their families, cared for their neighbors, worked hard through changing seasons, and left the world just a little better than they found it. As he quietly walked back toward the iron gate, Ethan turned for one final look. The fog had begun drifting across the hillside once again, wrapping the old stones in a soft silver mist. Within moments, many of them had disappeared from view, almost as though the mountains themselves were gently protecting the memories resting there. Ethan tipped his hat ever so slightly, climbed back into the station wagon, and continued along the rain-washed road, carrying those quiet stories with him as the journey beyond the fog unfolded one peaceful mile at a time. When Ethan returned to Old Mountain Road, the afternoon had settled into a peaceful calm. The rain had almost disappeared, leaving only a light mist that hovered above the fields like a thin silk blanket. Water still clung to every blade of grass, and the forest shimmered beneath the soft light filtering through the clouds. The station wagon rolled quietly downhill. The tires made almost no sound on the damp pavement. After several gentle curves, the valley widened, revealing broad meadows bordered by split-rail fences that stretched toward distant hills. A small herd of dairy cows grazed peacefully, paying little attention to the changing weather. It was a scene that could have belonged to almost any generation. Agriculture has always been one of the foundations of American life. Long before factories and large cities expanded across the nation, family farms supplied communities with milk, corn, wheat, vegetables, apples, and livestock. Even today, many farms in the Appalachian region remain family-owned, with knowledge and traditions passed from parents to children over generations. Ethan noticed an old red mailbox standing beside the road. Its paint had faded under decades of summer sun and winter snow. The small metal flag was raised. A few minutes later, a white postal truck appeared around the bend. It wasn't moving quickly. The driver stopped at every mailbox, placing letters inside with quiet precision before continuing to the next. Ethan smiled. The United States Postal Service traces its roots back to 1775, when the Continental Congress appointed Benjamin Franklin as the first postmaster general. Over the centuries, mail carriers became trusted figures in cities, suburbs, and rural communities alike, delivering letters, newspapers, medicines, birthday cards, and news from loved ones across thousands of miles. For families living in remote mountain valleys, the daily arrival of the mail was often one of the most anticipated moments of the day. Long before emails and text messages, handwritten letters connected generations. They carried news of births, graduations, engagements, military service, safe arrivals, and sometimes simply a few comforting words reminding someone they were loved. The postal truck disappeared over the next hill, leaving the road quiet once again. Ethan continued driving until he reached a small wooden picnic area overlooking the valley. A single picnic table stood beneath an enormous sugar maple tree. The rain had stopped completely. Tiny drops still fell occasionally from the branches overhead, creating gentle circles in nearby puddles. He switched off the engine. Silence settled around him. Not the silence of emptiness, the silence of contentment. He opened the old paper map one more time. Its folded edges had become softer after spending the day on the passenger seat. Across one corner, someone had lightly sketched a tiny compass rose by hand. Below it appeared another short sentence. Every road is a story. Every traveler becomes part of it. Ethan traced the words with his finger. How many hands had unfolded this map before his? Perhaps a family in the 1940s searching for a scenic picnic spot. Perhaps a young couple exploring the mountains on their honeymoon. Perhaps a retired schoolteacher enjoying one last road trip before returning home. The map carried no answers, only possibilities that seemed perfectly fitting. History often leaves us with questions as beautiful as the answers themselves. A cool breeze swept gently across the overlook. The fog began lifting from the valley floor, revealing winding streams, weathered barns, church steeples, and distant farmhouses that had remained hidden all morning. Little by little, the landscape revealed itself, just as every chapter of history does. Not all at once, but patiently. To those willing to slow down and look, Ethan folded the old map with care and placed it back on the passenger seat. He started the station wagon once more, and the familiar hum of the engine blended gently with the quiet sounds of the countryside. The road continued south, following the curves of Willow Creek. The creek never seemed to rush. It wandered through the valley at its own peaceful pace, bending around smooth stones, old sycamore trees, and fields where wildflowers swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. Watching the water flow reminded Ethan of something his grandfather had once said. Rivers never argue with the land. They simply find their way. Perhaps that was why so many early American settlements were built beside rivers and creeks. Fresh water was essential for drinking, farming, cooking, and transportation. Before railroads and paved highways connected the country, rivers often determined where towns would grow and where families would build their homes. Many of America's oldest communities began with nothing more than a dependable source of clean water. After another mile or two, Ethan noticed a small white building standing beside the creek. A wooden sign identified it as the Willow Creek General Store, according to another sign hanging beneath it. The store had first opened in 1898. He parked beneath a large oak tree whose branches stretched protectively over the gravel lot. As Ethan stepped inside, a small brass bell above the door gave a cheerful ring. The store felt wonderfully unchanged. Wide wooden floorboards creaked softly beneath his boots. Glass jars filled with old-fashioned candy lined one shelf. Nearby stood neatly stacked bags of flour, locally made jams, handmade soaps, and shelves of canned peaches, green beans, and blackberry preserves prepared by families from nearby farms. Behind the counter stood an elderly woman with kind eyes and silver hair tied neatly into a bun. "Afternoon," she said warmly. "Afternoon," Ethan replied, passing through. "I suppose I am." Smiled knowingly. Most people think they're passing through. Sometimes these mountains have a way of making people stay a little longer. General stores like this once served as the social center of countless rural communities across America. Long before large supermarkets appeared, neighbors gathered in small country stores not only to purchase supplies, but also to exchange local news, discuss the weather, and simply enjoy one another's company. Some people came to buy flour, others came for conversation. Both were considered equally important. Near the front window stood an old Coca-Cola cooler from the 1940s. Its bright red paint had faded over time, but it remained carefully preserved. Beside it rested a rack of postcards showing waterfalls, covered bridges, mountain overlooks, and autumn forests glowing with brilliant shades of red and gold. Ethan picked up one of the postcards. It showed Willow Creek Valley just after sunrise, with fog drifting gently through the hills. On the back was a simple sentence. "Some places don't ask to be remembered. They simply never leave your heart." He smiled. Without saying a word, he bought the postcard, not because he planned to mail it, but because he wanted a small reminder of this quiet valley. As he stepped back outside, the rain had finally ended. The clouds were beginning to separate. Tiny patches of blue sky appeared above the distant ridges, while beams of late afternoon sunlight broke through the remaining mist. Every raindrop still clinging to the trees sparkled like tiny pieces of crystal. The valley seemed to glow. It was as though the mountains were quietly thanking the rain for another peaceful day. Ethan slipped the postcard into the folded map, climbed back into the station wagon, and continued his slow drive along Willow Creek, wondering what gentle piece of America's past might be waiting around the next quiet bend. The afternoon sunlight grew warmer as the clouds slowly drifted apart, though the mountains still held onto ribbons of mist that lingered between the valleys. The rain had finally passed, leaving the countryside washed clean and glowing with a quiet brilliance. Every leaf seemed brighter. Every stream reflected the sky like polished glass. The station wagon rolled peacefully along Willow Creek, where the road eventually climbed toward a broad overlook marked by a simple wooden sign. ridge scenic overlook, Ethan pulled into the gravel turnout and stepped outside. The air felt fresh after the rain. A cool breeze moved gently across the ridge, carrying the scent of pine, wildflowers, and damp stone. Below him stretched an endless panorama of rolling mountains, winding rivers, and quiet farms. The fog that had hidden the valleys all morning was beginning to lift. Little by little, the landscape revealed itself. A church steeple, a red barn, a silver ribbon of railroad tracks, a covered bridge. The distant rooftops of a tiny town. Everything seemed connected, as though each place were another page in one enormous history book. Near the overlook stood a weathered telescope that visitors could use without charge. Its metal surface had grown smooth from countless hands over the years. Ethan looked through the lens. Far below, he could see an old farmhouse standing beside a field of golden hay. Smoke drifted lazily from its chimney. A tractor rested quietly near a weathered barn. Nothing extraordinary was happening, and yet, it felt beautiful. Sometimes the most remarkable part of history is not what changed. It is what endured. Many Appalachian farming families have remained on the same land for generations, preserving traditions, recipes, music, craftsmanship, and ways of life that connect the present with the past. Though the world beyond the mountains changed rapidly, these valleys often held onto customs that might otherwise have been forgotten. As Ethan continued looking across the valley, he noticed a narrow footpath leading from the overlook to a small stone bench beneath an old chestnut oak. Carved into the back of the bench were simple words, dedicated to every traveler who took the time to stop. He smiled. Those words seemed perfectly suited to this journey. Modern life often rewards speed, faster highways, faster trains, faster airplanes, faster conversations. Yet history rarely reveals itself to those in a hurry. It quietly waits. For someone willing to pause, to listen, to notice. The breeze gently stirred the branches overhead. A hawk circled effortlessly above the valley, riding invisible currents of warm air. Birds of prey have long soared above these mountains, using rising thermals to travel great distances while expending very little energy. Long before humans mapped these valleys, hawks, eagles, and falcons crossed these same ridges with the changing seasons, following ancient paths written not on paper, but in the winds themselves. Ethan remained on the stone bench for several peaceful minutes. He wasn't thinking about where the road would lead tomorrow. He wasn't checking the time. He wasn't planning the next destination. He was simply grateful. Grateful for the rain, grateful for the quiet roads, grateful for forgotten schoolhouses, old mills, covered bridges, country stores, and kind strangers who had shared pieces of America's story without expecting anything in return. As the sun dipped lower toward the western ridges, the mountains were bathed in a soft golden light. The fog had almost completely disappeared. The journey beyond the fog, Ethan realized, had never really been about finding a destination. It had been about discovering that some of America's greatest stories are hidden in its quietest places, waiting patiently for the next traveler who chooses the slow road. The sun slowly drifted toward the western horizon, casting long golden rays across the Blue Ridge Mountains. The rain clouds had finally broken apart, revealing patches of pale blue sky, while a cool evening breeze carried the fresh scent of pine and damp earth across the overlook. Ethan remained on the stone bench a little longer. The quiet seemed almost impossible to leave. Far below, Willow Creek reflected the evening light as it wound gracefully through the valley. Farmhouses glowed softly beneath the setting sun, and wisps of mist still lingered in the lowest fields, slowly disappearing as the air became cooler. Every landscape seemed to be taking one long, peaceful breath. As Ethan returned to the station wagon, he noticed another small sign near the edge of the overlook. It pointed toward a narrow walking trail. Heritage Trail established 1937. Curiosity, once again, encouraged him to slow down. The trail was short, winding gently through towering oak trees before arriving at a circular stone terrace overlooking the valley. At its center stood a bronze plaque. It read, "This overlook was built by the Civilian Conservation Corps, dedicated to the young men whose work preserved America's natural beauty for future generations." Ethan stood quietly, reading the words several times. During the Great Depression, The Civilian Conservation Corps, often called the CCC, employed hundreds of thousands of young Americans between 1933 and 1942. They planted billions of trees, built hiking trails, constructed overlooks, restored parks, prevented soil erosion, and helped develop many of the scenic areas that millions of visitors continue to enjoy today. Much of the beauty found in America's national and state parks owes a quiet debt to their hard work. Many of those young workers lived in simple camps. They earned modest wages. Most of their pay was sent home to help support their families during difficult economic times. Their efforts left behind something far greater than roads and stone walls. They left places where future generations could pause, breathe, and appreciate the timeless beauty of the American landscape. Ethan ran his fingers gently across the smooth bronze plaque. Nearly 90 years had passed since those young men shaped these stones with hand tools, wheelbarrows, and determination. The overlook still welcomed travelers, just as they had hoped it would. The evening grew quieter. A gentle chorus of crickets began rising from the tall grass below. Somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called from the edge of the forest, its familiar song echoing softly through the cooling air. For generations, sounds like these have marked the arrival of evening across rural America. Long before televisions filled living rooms with noise, many families ended their days listening to birds, insects, frogs, and the rustling of leaves outside open windows. Nature itself became the soundtrack of daily life. Ethan smiled. He realized something had changed during his journey. When he had first entered the mountains, he had been searching for history. Now, he no longer felt the need to search. History seemed to be everywhere, in the quiet roads, in the old bridges, in forgotten schoolhouses, in family farms, in handwritten postcards, in the gentle kindness of strangers, and perhaps most of all, in the peaceful landscapes that had patiently watched each generation arrive, live their ordinary lives, and quietly become part of America's unfolding story. As twilight settled over the valley, Ethan took one final look across the mountains. The first stars were beginning to appear above the eastern sky. The road home still waited, but there was no hurry. There never had been. The mountains had waited millions of years. They could wait one peaceful evening more. Twilight slowly faded into night as Ethan guided the station wagon back onto the quiet mountain road. The first stars shimmered above the highest ridges, while a thin crescent moon rose silently over the eastern horizon. The pavement, still damp from the day's rain, reflected the moonlight in soft silver streaks that stretched ahead like a peaceful ribbon. The road was almost empty. Only once in a while did another pair of headlights appear in the distance before quietly disappearing around a bend. Ethan rolled the window down slightly. The evening air was cool and wonderfully fresh. Somewhere nearby, a creek continued its endless journey through the valley, sounding exactly as it must have sounded hundreds of years ago. Water does not remember the names of those who stand beside it, yet it faithfully carries every season forward. The mountains seemed even older beneath the moonlight. Their outlines softened into gentle shadows, rising one behind another until they blended with the night sky itself. Long before electric lights illuminated American towns, moonlit nights guided countless travelers. Farmers returned home after long days in the fields. Wagon drivers carefully followed familiar trails. Families gathered on front porches, where the moon provided enough light to continue conversations long after sunset. For many rural communities, the night was never something to fear. It was simply another peaceful part of the day. After several quiet miles, Ethan noticed a small wooden sign pointing toward an old stone building. Mountain Historical Society. The lights were still on. Curiosity led him down the narrow driveway. The building had once been the county courthouse, constructed in the middle of the 19th century before being lovingly restored as a local museum. Its white columns and hand-cut limestone walls stood proudly beneath the moonlight, while flower gardens surrounded the entrance. Although modest in size, the museum represented something important. Across America, thousands of local historical societies work quietly to preserve the stories that larger museums often overlook. Volunteers collect family photographs, handwritten diaries, military uniforms, farming tools, quilts, newspaper clippings, and everyday objects that tell the story of ordinary people. Without these organizations, countless pieces of local history would simply disappear. Inside, the museum felt calm and welcoming. Soft lights illuminated carefully arranged exhibits. One display featured Native American arrowheads discovered in nearby valleys. Another showcased handmade tools used by blacksmiths and carpenters during the early 19th century. There were handwritten school attendance books, old church hymnals, railroad tickets, family Bibles with births and marriages carefully recorded inside their pages. None of the items were grand treasures. Yet together, they painted a remarkable picture of everyday American life across generations. Ethan paused before a glass case containing dozens of faded family photographs. One image showed children standing barefoot beside a creek on a warm summer afternoon. Another captured neighbors gathered for a harvest festival sometime around 1915. There were smiles everywhere. History often speaks through famous speeches and important documents, but just as often, it smiles quietly from old family photographs. A volunteer curator noticed Ethan studying the display. She smiled warmly. "We like to say this museum doesn't preserve objects." Ethan looked at her curiously. "What does it preserve?" she answered without hesitation. "Memories." The single word lingered in the quiet room. Perhaps that was the purpose of every old road Ethan had traveled. Every bridge, every schoolhouse, every inn, every forgotten valley. Not simply to preserve places, but to preserve memories. Outside, the moon climbed a little higher above the Blue Ridge Mountains. The rain had finally become only a memory, yet somehow, its gentle rhythm still echoed in Ethan's mind, accompanying him as faithfully as the quiet road stretching into the peaceful American night. The volunteer locked the museum's front door behind the last visitors and wished Ethan a peaceful evening. Outside, the mountain air had grown cooler. The moon floated high above the valley now, casting a gentle silver glow across the old courthouse steps and the quiet streets beyond. Ethan decided not to continue driving just yet. Instead, he wandered slowly through the small historic town. There was no traffic, no loud music, only the soft chirping of crickets and the distant murmur of Willow Creek flowing somewhere beyond the trees. The town's main street was lined with brick buildings that had stood for well over a century. Their storefront windows reflected the moonlight, while old-fashioned street lamps cast warm circles of light onto the sidewalks. A barber shop, a family-owned pharmacy, a bakery that would open again before sunrise, a tiny bookstore with handwritten recommendations displayed in the window. Each building seemed to have its own quiet personality. Many American small towns developed around a central main street, where businesses, churches, schools, banks, and community halls stood within walking distance of one another. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, these streets became the heart of local life, hosting holiday parades, farmers' markets, patriotic celebrations, and everyday conversations between neighbors. Though many towns have changed over the decades, countless historic main streets remain carefully preserved, offering a glimpse into the rhythm of earlier American life. As Ethan continued walking, he noticed a beautifully restored movie theater. Its glowing marquee read "Tonight Classic American Cinema." The building had first opened in 1938, long before streaming services or home entertainment systems. Neighborhood movie theaters served as gathering places for families and friends. Watching a film together was more than entertainment. It was a shared community experience. On weekends, children eagerly waited in line with popcorn in hand, while couples enjoyed evening shows beneath bright neon lights. The theater's entrance was closed for the night, yet the lights remained on, almost as though they were quietly welcoming tomorrow's visitors. Across the street stood a bronze statue of a young girl sitting on a park bench with an open book resting in her lap. A small plaque beneath it carried a simple inscription: "Every generation writes another chapter." Ethan sat on the empty end of the bench. The words felt fitting. History is never truly finished. It continues quietly each day, a child learning to read, a baker preparing bread before dawn, a teacher unlocking a classroom, a mail carrier beginning another route, a family sharing dinner together after a rainy drive through the mountains. These ordinary moments rarely appear in history books, yet together, they become history. The courthouse clock struck 9 gentle chimes. Their echoes drifted across the quiet streets before fading into the cool Appalachian night. Ethan looked toward the station wagon parked beneath an old maple tree. Tomorrow would bring another road, another valley, another forgotten story patiently waiting to be discovered. But tonight, the little town rested peacefully beneath the moonlight, just as it had for generations. And somewhere beyond the rooftops, the Blue Ridge Mountains stood silently beneath the stars, watching over every quiet street, every warm front porch, and every traveler fortunate enough to slow down and listen. The town remained quiet as Ethan eased the station wagon onto Main Street once more. The engine hummed softly beneath the hood, but otherwise the night was almost perfectly silent. Storefront lights slowly switched off one by one. The bakery darkened. The bookstore closed its shutters. Only the old clock tower and a few street lamps continued shining, their warm light reflecting gently across the rain-washed pavement. As Ethan drove toward the edge of town, he noticed a railroad crossing. The warning lights were not flashing. The crossing gates stood open. He slowed the car anyway. Beyond the track stood a beautifully restored train depot. Its wooden benches, wide overhanging roof, and carefully painted trim looked exactly as they might have appeared nearly a century ago. A sign beside the entrance read, Willow Junction, Depot built 1911. The parking area was empty, yet the depot somehow felt alive. Train stations like this once served as the heartbeat of countless American towns. Passengers arrived carrying leather suitcases, soldiers departed for distant assignments, children greeted grandparents stepping off afternoon trains, and local farmers shipped fresh produce to nearby cities. Every platform witnessed countless reunions and farewells. The station clock never stopped. Neither did the stories passing through. Ethan parked beside the depot and stepped onto the old platform. The wooden boards creaked softly beneath his boots. A cool breeze drifted down the tracks, carrying the faint scent of creosote from the railroad ties and damp pine from the surrounding forest. Mounted beneath the station roof hung a large mechanical clock. Its hands quietly approached 10 o'clock, long before smartphones or electronic signs displayed departure times. Station clocks were trusted by travelers throughout America. Conductors, engineers, and passengers depended upon their accuracy, making these clocks one of the most recognizable symbols of the railroad age. Inside the waiting room, polished oak benches faced the tracks. Framed black and white photographs lined the walls. One showed a steam locomotive releasing clouds of white vapor beneath a snowy mountain morning. Another captured smiling families boarding a passenger train during the summer of 1947. A third photograph showed local volunteers welcoming home military veterans after World War II. The depot was more than a transportation center. It had been a place where emotions quietly filled the room. Hope, excitement, nervous anticipation, relief, joy, even sorrow. History is often measured by events, but places like this remind us that history is also measured by feelings. A handwritten chalkboard timetable still stood near the ticket window. Although decorative today, it listed the names of historic passenger trains that had once connected mountain communities with larger cities. Reading those names, Ethan imagined families beginning vacations, students leaving for college, and young couples setting out together to build new lives. Each journey started with a single ticket. Outside, the rails stretched into the darkness. Under the moonlight, they looked almost endless. Parallel lines disappearing beyond the next bend, beyond the next hill, toward destinations unseen. The volunteer from the Historical Society had told Ethan that museums preserve memories. Standing on the quiet platform, he realized railroads preserved something else, possibility. Every departing train carried dreams toward an unknown tomorrow. Every arriving train brought home stories from somewhere beyond the mountains. Ethan listened carefully, far in the distance, barely noticeable at first. A freight train sounded its whistle, long, low, gentle. The sound floated across the valley before slowly fading into the peaceful Appalachian night. He smiled. Some sounds never truly disappear. They simply become part of the landscape, waiting for another quiet traveler to hear them once again. Ethan remained on the depot platform long after the distant whistle had faded. The rails stretched into the moonlit valley, their polished steel reflecting faint ribbons of silver beneath the night sky. A gentle breeze wandered through the station, carrying with it the fresh scent of pine forests still damp from the day's rain. Everything felt wonderfully still. The old station clock quietly marked another minute, then another. Time seemed slower here, not because the clock moved differently, but because no one was rushing it. After a while, Ethan returned to the station wagon and continued driving through the sleeping countryside. The road followed the railroad tracks for several peaceful miles before turning toward open farmland. Moonlight rested gently across wide hayfields. Old red barns stood quietly beneath enormous sycamore trees. Wooden fences cast long shadows across the grass. Every farmhouse window glowed with a warm amber light. Families were likely finishing the day much as generations before them had done, reading a favorite book, sharing tomorrow's plans, washing supper dishes, rocking gently on the front porch before bedtime. Although technology has transformed daily life, many traditions in rural America continue much as they have for decades. County fairs, church suppers, harvest festivals, quilting circles, and family reunions remain cherished parts of community life, bringing neighbors together across generations. These gatherings remind people that history is not only something remembered, it is something continually created. A few miles farther along, Ethan noticed another roadside marker. Unlike the others, this one was made entirely of wood. Its carved letters read, Heritage Farm established 1819. Visitors welcome. A narrow lane led toward a white farmhouse surrounded by centuries-old maple trees. Even at this late hour, a lantern burned softly on the front porch. Ethan drove slowly toward the house. The farm looked peaceful beneath the moonlight. A weathered red barn stood nearby. Beyond it stretched rolling fields where horses rested quietly behind split-rail fences. An old windmill turned slowly in the gentle breeze. American family farms have often remained in the same families for generations, with land, skills, and traditions passed from parents to children. Some farms have survived wars, economic hardships, floods, droughts, and changing technologies, continuing to produce food while preserving a deep connection to the land. Near the porch stood a large wooden sign listing the names of every family generation that had cared for the farm: 1819, 1848, 1876, 1909, 1943, 1978, 2006. Each date represented another chapter, another family, another lifetime of early mornings, changing seasons, and quiet determination. Ethan found himself smiling. History was no longer something he searched for. It seemed to greet him wherever he traveled, in every valley, on every porch, along every forgotten road. The lantern hanging beside the farmhouse door flickered gently in the cool night air. Its warm light reminded him of the inn where this remarkable journey had begun. The same peaceful glow, the same welcoming feeling, the same quiet promise that every traveler has another story waiting just beyond the next sunrise. Above the fields, the stars shone brilliantly. Without city lights to dim them, the Milky Way stretched across the Appalachian sky like a pale river of light. For thousands of years, people have looked upward in wonder. Indigenous communities, early settlers, railroad workers, farmers, and modern travelers have all stood beneath these same stars, finding comfort in a sky that changes far less than the world below. Ethan leaned against the station wagon for a few peaceful moments. He took one slow breath, then another. The rain had washed the world clean. The mountains stood quietly in the distance. The stars watched from above. And somewhere beyond the rolling hills, morning was already preparing to write another gentle page in America's timeless story. The night passed quietly over Heritage Farm. Before long, the eastern horizon began to brighten with the faintest hint of blue. The stars slowly faded one by one, not because they had disappeared, but because a new day was patiently arriving across the Appalachian Mountains. Ethan had chosen to rest for a few hours in his station wagon beneath the old maple trees. He awoke just before sunrise. The world outside was wonderfully still. Tiny drops of dew rested on the grass. A gentle layer of mist floated above the fields, while the distant mountains appeared as soft blue silhouettes against the growing light. The lantern on the farmhouse porch had gone out. In its place, warm golden light now glowed from the kitchen windows. Somewhere inside, breakfast was already being prepared. The peaceful aroma of fresh bread drifted across the cool morning air. Not long afterward, the farmhouse door opened. An elderly farmer stepped onto the porch carrying a steaming mug of coffee. He tipped his cap toward Ethan with a friendly smile. "Morning, morning," Ethan replied. "Beautiful start to the day. Usually is around here." Farmer looked across the mist-covered fields. "If you're awake early enough." Ethan walked over to the fence where the two men quietly admired the sunrise together. Neither seemed eager to interrupt the peaceful moment. As the first rays of sunlight reached the valley, hundreds of tiny spider webs stretched between fence posts and tall grasses suddenly became visible. Each one shimmered with countless drops of dew. Nature often hides remarkable beauty in ordinary places. Sometimes all it takes is the right light to reveal it. The farmer noticed Ethan smiling. "My wife always says the mountains reward patient people." He laughed softly. "Found she's usually right." Throughout American history, farming has required patience above nearly every other quality. Seeds planted in spring cannot be hurried toward harvest. Orchards take years before producing fruit. Fields demand careful attention through changing weather, teaching generations that the best rewards often arrive slowly. Perhaps that is why so many farmers develop a deep appreciation for the passing seasons. Each season brings different work, different colors, different sounds, yet each is equally important. The farmer invited Ethan to walk toward the old barn. Its weathered wooden beams had darkened with age, but they remained remarkably strong. Inside rested a beautifully restored horse-drawn wagon. Its iron wheels had been polished, its wooden sides carefully preserved. "My great-great-grandfather bought this wagon in 1868, the farmer explained. It carried crops into town every autumn. He gently rested one hand upon the smooth wooden rail. It never traveled very fast." He smiled. "But it always arrived." Ethan couldn't help but admire the quiet wisdom hidden inside those words. America's early roads demanded patience. Travelers accepted long journeys because they had little choice. Perhaps in moving more slowly, they noticed things that modern travelers often miss. The changing colors of distant hills, the scent of fresh rain, birdsong drifting through open fields, friendly conversations with strangers, the simple pleasure of reaching home after many peaceful miles. A rooster crowed somewhere beyond the barn. Soon afterward, several barn swallows darted gracefully across the brightening sky. They circled above the fields before disappearing toward the creek. Barn swallows have shared America's farms for centuries, building their nests beneath barns, bridges, and covered porches. Farmers have long welcomed them because they help control insects, making these graceful birds familiar companions throughout rural communities. The farmer looked toward the mountains. "They've watched over this place longer than anyone can remember." Ethan followed his gaze. Morning sunlight now touched the highest ridges. The fog slowly drifted away. Another beautiful day had quietly begun. Another page of history, written not with headlines, but with sunrise, simple kindness, and the peaceful rhythm of ordinary American life. After thanking the farmer for his kindness, Ethan climbed back into the station wagon and continued along the quiet country road. The morning sun rose a little higher with every passing mile, gently warming the fields that had glistened with dew only moments before. Wisps of fog still lingered above Willow Creek, slowly dissolving into the clear blue sky. The rain that had begun this journey now felt like a distant memory, yet its calm spirit remained with Ethan. The road eventually followed an old railroad embankment where wildflowers bloomed in shades of purple, yellow, and white. Queen Anne's lace swayed gently beside black-eyed Susan's, while butterflies drifted lazily from blossom to blossom. The countryside seemed wonderfully alive. Without warning, Ethan noticed an old wooden water tower standing beside the tracks. A faded sign beneath it read, Willow Junction Water Tower built 1909, he pulled over once more. The towering structure stood as a quiet reminder of another chapter in America's transportation history. During the steam locomotive era, water towers were essential along railroad routes. Steam engines consumed enormous amounts of water, requiring frequent stops to refill their boilers. Small railroad towns often grew around these service points, where engineers, mechanics, station agents, and local businesses supported the constant movement of trains across the country. Today, many of those towers remain as historic landmarks. They no longer fill locomotives. Instead, they quietly fill imaginations. Ethan stood beneath the weathered wooden structure, listening to the gentle breeze moving through its beams. Somewhere nearby, he heard the soft ringing of a bicycle bell. Turning toward the sound, he saw two children riding along a narrow gravel lane. Their laughter echoed through the peaceful valley before disappearing beyond a row of maple trees. Simple moments like these have always been part of rural America. Children exploring dirt roads, fishing in nearby creeks, flying homemade kites across open fields, learning to ride bicycles beneath watchful parents. These everyday experiences rarely appear in history books, yet they shape childhood memories that often last a lifetime. The station wagon continued onward until Ethan reached another covered bridge crossing Willow Creek. Unlike the first bridge he had seen, this one was painted bright white. Its wooden beams glowed softly beneath the morning sunlight. A bronze plaque explained that local residents had restored the bridge together after a flood damaged it decades earlier. Community restoration projects have preserved hundreds of historic covered bridges throughout the United States. Rather than replacing these landmarks with modern structures, many towns chose to repair them, recognizing that the bridges connected more than roads. They connected generations. Ethan slowly drove across the bridge. The tires echoed gently against the thick wooden floor. Sunlight streamed through the narrow side openings, creating moving bands of light across the dashboard for a brief moment. It felt as though time itself had slowed. When he reached the opposite side, he stopped once again and looked back. The bridge stood peacefully above the flowing creek, strong, graceful, patient. Much like the people who had built it, much like the mountains surrounding it, Ethan smiled. The farther he traveled, the more he understood something the innkeeper had quietly taught him on that rainy afternoon. History isn't hidden. It patiently waits in ordinary places, for ordinary people, who are willing to slow down long enough to see its extraordinary beauty. The rain had become a fine mist once again. Tiny droplets floated through the cool mountain air, settling gently on the hood of the old car. The innkeeper handed him a neatly folded paper map. "I know everyone uses GPS these days," he said with a smile, "but sometimes an old map encourages a different kind of journey." Ethan unfolded it carefully. The paper was soft with age, its edges slightly worn from years of careful use. Thin blue lines marked rivers. Green patches represented forests. Small black dots showed tiny communities, many of which no longer appeared on modern highway maps. Several winding roads crossed the page like gentle streams. One of them was labeled simply, Old Mountain Road. "Most people don't drive that way anymore," the innkeeper explained. "But if you're looking for history instead of speed," he smiled, "it's the better road." Ethan thanked him warmly. As he climbed into the station wagon, the innkeeper gave a small wave from the porch. There were no long goodbyes. Some meetings don't need many words. The best ones remain quietly in your memory long after you've driven away. The engine came to life with its familiar gentle rumble. Slowly, the station wagon rolled down the gravel driveway and returned to the rain-soaked highway. For a few miles, Ethan followed the main road through the valley. Then, just as the old map suggested, he reached a weathered wooden sign. The paint had faded almost completely. It simply read, Old Mountain Road. The narrow lane curved gently into the forest. Ethan turned the steering wheel. Almost immediately, the world seemed to change. The pavement became narrower. Tall trees leaned closer together. The rain sounded louder beneath the leafy canopy overhead. There were no painted center lines, no roadside businesses, no billboards, only a quiet road winding peacefully through one of America's oldest mountain landscapes. Roads like this once connected isolated farming communities long before major highways reached rural Appalachia. Many followed even older wagon routes, which themselves often traced Native American footpaths that had crossed the mountains for centuries. Rather than cutting straight through hills, these roads respected the shape of the land. They curved around ridges. They followed streams. They climbed gently through natural mountain gaps. Engineers had worked with nature instead of against it. Ethan smiled as he drove. The slower pace felt strangely comforting. Every bend revealed another peaceful scene. A moss-covered stone wall, a wooden split-rail fence, a small red barn standing quietly in a meadow where a few horses grazed beneath the light rain. Everything looked as though it belonged exactly where it was. Not arranged for tourists, not designed for photographs, simply living its quiet life. A few miles farther along, Ethan crossed a narrow stone bridge. Below, a clear mountain creek flowed over smooth rocks polished by centuries of moving water. The sound was soft, steady, almost musical. Mountain streams like these have long supplied drinking water to Appalachian communities. Early settlers often built homes nearby, relying on fresh springs and creeks not only for water, but also to power small mills that ground grain into flour or cut timber for growing towns. Many of those old mill sites have disappeared. Yet the streams continue their endless journey, flowing through valleys much as they always have. Ethan lowered his window once again. The cool air carried the scent of cedar, wet leaves, and wild mint growing beside the creek. He slowed the car almost to a walking pace. There was no traffic behind him, no schedule waiting ahead, only the quiet road, the gentle rain, and another forgotten piece of America waiting just beyond the next curve. By late morning, the sky had turned a brilliant shade of blue. Only a few white clouds drifted lazily above the mountains, and the last traces of fog had disappeared from the valleys. Sunlight poured across the countryside, making every creek, meadow, and forest seem brighter than before. The station wagon followed a winding road lined with ancient oak trees. Their branches stretched high above the pavement, forming a natural canopy that had shaded travelers for generations. Some of these trees had likely been young saplings when Abraham Lincoln was president. Others may have already been standing when the first telegraph wires crossed these mountains. Trees often become silent witnesses to history. They do not speak. They simply remain, season after season, generation after generation. After several peaceful miles, Ethan reached a small town square. At its center stood a beautiful courthouse built from locally quarried limestone. Its clock tower rose proudly above the surrounding buildings, while colorful flower beds circled a large stone fountain nearby. Children laughed as they tossed pennies into the water. Parents rested on shaded benches beneath towering elm trees. An elderly couple quietly fed songbirds from a paper bag filled with birdseed. Everything moved gently. No one appeared hurried. Town squares have long served as gathering places throughout the United States. Farmers' markets, Independence Day celebrations, holiday tree lightings, community concerts, and local festivals often centered around these shared public spaces, strengthening the connections between neighbors across generations. The courthouse clock quietly struck 11. Its familiar chime echoed across the square before fading into the warm summer air. Ethan wandered toward a nearby farmer's market that had just begun for the day. Rows of wooden stalls displayed baskets overflowing with peaches, tomatoes, sweet corn, apples, blueberries, fresh honey, and homemade breads. The scent of cinnamon drifted from a nearby bakery stand where warm apple pies cooled on wooden racks. Farmers' markets have connected American communities since colonial times. Long before supermarkets became common, local producers gathered regularly to sell fresh fruits, vegetables, dairy products, baked goods, and handcrafted items directly to their neighbors. Even today, these markets continue to celebrate regional traditions while supporting family farms and local businesses. One elderly woman offered Ethan a slice of freshly baked apple pie. "It came out of the oven less than an hour ago," she said with a smile. He accepted gratefully. The crust was light and flaky. Apples were sweet with just a touch of cinnamon, simple, comforting, timeless. As he thanked her, she laughed softly. "My grandmother taught me this recipe. My mother taught me. My granddaughter is learning." Recipes often become family heirlooms just as valuable as photographs or journals. They carry memories from one kitchen to another, preserving traditions through flavors rather than words. Nearby, a young violinist began playing a gentle Appalachian folk melody beneath the shade of an old maple tree. Families paused to listen. Children sat cross-legged on the grass. No tickets, no grand stage, just music quietly filling the warm mountain air. Appalachian folk music reflects a rich blend of cultural influences, including traditions brought by immigrants from Scotland, Ireland, England, Germany, and many other parts of Europe, woven together with American experiences over generations. Fiddles, banjos, dulcimers, and acoustic guitars became familiar companions at family gatherings, community dances, and front porch evenings throughout the region. The melody drifted gently across the town square. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment. The music, the laughter, the scent of fresh bread, the courthouse clock, the warm sunshine after days of rain. Together, they created another quiet chapter in his journey. He realized that America's history was not only preserved in monuments and museums, it also lived in recipes handed down through families, in songs remembered by heart, in neighbors greeting one another by name, and in peaceful mornings where ordinary life unfolded at its own unhurried pace. With one last look around the lively but tranquil town square, Ethan returned to the station wagon, knowing the road ahead still held countless gentle stories waiting beyond the next bend. The road gently left the town square behind, and before long, the sounds of conversation and music faded into the distance. Once again, Ethan found himself surrounded by the peaceful countryside. Golden fields stretched toward the horizon. White fences followed the gentle curves of the hills. Small streams reflected the afternoon sunlight as they quietly wound through green pastures where horses grazed beneath tall oak trees. There was something wonderfully reassuring about returning to the open road. The station wagon moved at an easy pace. There was no reason to hurry. The mountains were patient, so was the journey. Several miles later, Ethan noticed a weathered sign pointing toward a historic orchard. Hawthorne Apple Orchard family owned since 1874, curiosity invited him to turn onto the narrow gravel lane. Rows upon rows of apple trees stretched across the hillside. Some carried bright red fruit. Others displayed golden and green varieties that sparkled beneath the afternoon sun. A gentle breeze moved through the branches, carrying the sweet fragrance of ripening apples. It was a scent that instantly reminded Ethan of autumn, even though summer had not yet ended. An elderly woman wearing a straw hat greeted him with a warm smile. "Welcome to Hawthorne Orchard." She handed him a freshly picked apple. "Go ahead. The trees don't mind sharing." Ethan took a bite. The apple was crisp, cool, perfectly sweet with just a hint of tartness. Apple orchards have been part of American agriculture since the colonial era. Early settlers planted orchards not only for fresh fruit, but also for preserving harvests through drying, cider making, and baking. Over generations, many family orchards became lasting traditions, with trees planted by grandparents continuing to bear fruit for their grandchildren. The woman pointed toward one particularly large apple tree standing near the center of the orchard. "My great-grandfather planted that one." Ethan looked at its wide trunk. Its branches stretched gracefully in every direction. "Old is it?" she smiled. "About 150 years. Tree had survived powerful storms, harsh winters, dry summers, changing generations, yet every year it quietly produced another harvest. There was a lesson hidden within that old tree. Strength does not always come from standing against every storm. Sometimes it comes from learning how to bend with the wind. Beyond the orchard stood a small wooden barn where fresh cider was still pressed using traditional methods during harvest season. Inside, several antique tools were displayed on the walls: wooden apple crates, hand-woven picking baskets, iron pruning shears, old family photographs showing smiling workers standing among overflowing wagons of apples. The woman noticed Ethan studying the pictures. "We keep them here to remind ourselves who planted all of this." Family photographs often become living bridges between generations. They capture ordinary moments that later become extraordinary simply because time continues moving forward. A smiling child in one picture eventually becomes a grandparent in another, while the landscape behind them quietly changes one season at a time. Outside, a gentle breeze carried a few loose apple blossoms across the grass. Although the harvest season was still ahead, new blossoms had already begun appearing on younger trees. Nature was quietly preparing for the future while celebrating the present. As Ethan thanked the woman and returned to the station wagon, she offered one final piece of advice. "Wherever your road takes you," she smiled kindly, "always leave enough time to notice the orchards." He laughed softly. "I think that's good advice for more than just driving." She nodded. "It usually is." The afternoon sun continued its slow journey across the Appalachian sky as Ethan drove away from Hawthorne Orchard, carrying with him not only the taste of a fresh apple, but another peaceful reminder that history often grows quietly, season after season, root by root, generation by generation. The road gently curved away from Hawthorne Orchard, following the rolling hills as the afternoon settled into a peaceful golden light. The station wagon moved quietly beneath long rows of sycamores whose broad branches stretched across the road, creating shifting patterns of sunlight and shade. Ethan lowered the window. The fresh scent of apples slowly faded, replaced by the fragrance of warm pine, freshly cut hay, and the clean air that follows several days of gentle rain. The mountains looked different now, without the fog. Every ridge was clearly visible. Yet Ethan realized something unexpected. He almost missed the mist, not because it had hidden the landscape, but because it had taught him to appreciate every slow reveal. Sometimes beauty becomes more meaningful when it arrives patiently. A few miles later, another small sign appeared beside the road. Bluebird-covered bridge built 1886. The bridge rested quietly above a calm section of Willow Creek. Unlike the larger bridges Ethan had crossed earlier, this one was narrow enough for only a single vehicle. Its weathered wooden beams carried the rich scent of cedar that had deepened with age. He parked nearby and decided to walk across instead of driving. Each step produced a gentle creak beneath his boots. Sunlight filtered through the narrow openings in the bridge walls, painting soft stripes across the old timber floor. Below, the creek flowed peacefully around smooth stones polished by centuries of moving water. A pair of eastern bluebirds darted beneath the bridge before disappearing into the trees. Their bright feathers flashed like tiny pieces of the summer sky. The bridge had earned its name honestly. Covered bridges became especially common during the 19th century because their roofs protected the wooden beams from rain, snow, and harsh sunlight. By shielding the structure from weather, communities greatly extended the bridge's lifespan, allowing many to remain standing for well over 100 years. Across America, these bridges became more than practical crossings. They became beloved landmarks, symbols of craftsmanship, patience, and community pride. Near the center of the bridge, Ethan noticed dozens of names carefully written inside a visitor's journal resting on a small wooden table. Rather than carving initials into the historic timbers, guests were encouraged to leave a note inside the book. Some messages were simple: "Beautiful morning. Thank you for preserving this place." Grandparents met near this bridge in 1949. "We brought our grandchildren here today." Each entry added another quiet layer to the bridge's long story. History is not frozen. It continues every time someone remembers, every time someone visits. Every time someone chooses preservation instead of replacement. As Ethan closed the journal, an elderly couple slowly entered the bridge from the opposite side. They greeted him with warm smiles. "We've been coming here every anniversary for 42 years, the gentleman said. "Why this bridge?" Ethan asked. His wife looked around the peaceful valley before answering. "Because everything else changes." She gently rested her hand on the weathered wooden railing. "But this place reminds us who we were." Her words lingered long after they had continued their walk. The bridge did not merely connect two riverbanks, it connected memories, past and present, parents and children, grandparents and grandchildren. Travelers separated by generations, but united by the same quiet appreciation for places that endure. Ethan stood for one final moment in the center of the bridge. The creek whispered below. A soft breeze drifted through the open windows of the covered span. Somewhere high above, a hawk circled effortlessly against the deep blue sky. The rainstorm that had begun this remarkable journey was now completely gone, yet its gift remained. It had slowed the world just enough for Ethan to notice the stories that had always been there, waiting patiently. Beyond the fog, leaving bluebird-covered bridge behind, Ethan continued west as the afternoon slowly eased toward evening. The sunlight had become softer now, bathing the countryside in warm shades of amber and gold. Long shadows stretched across the meadows, and the distant Blue Ridge Mountains seemed almost painted, their gentle outlines fading into layers of pale blue. The road climbed steadily until it reached a broad, grassy ridge. At the top stood a small white chapel. It was modest in size. A simple wooden cross rested above the entrance. Its bell tower held a single bronze bell that had watched over the valley for more than a century. A weathered sign beside the path read, "Harmony Chapel, built 1872. The chapel door was open. Ethan stepped quietly inside. Sunlight streamed through tall stained glass windows, filling the room with soft colors that danced across the old wooden pews. The air carried the gentle scent of polished pine and aged hymnals. No one else was there, only silence, the peaceful kind that invites reflection. Throughout American history, small community churches often served many purposes beyond weekly worship. They hosted weddings, funerals, holiday gatherings, school programs, charity events, and town meetings. In many rural communities, the church became one of the strongest symbols of continuity, standing through generations of change while welcoming everyone who entered its doors. At the front of the chapel rested a beautifully crafted Bible, its leather cover softened by years of careful use. Nearby stood an old pump organ. Though silent now, Ethan imagined the room filled with gentle hymns on Sunday mornings many decades ago, voices rising together, families sitting side by side, children trying their best to sing along. Music has always been an important part of American community life. Long before recorded music became common, families and neighbors gathered to sing together in churches, schools, homes, and front parlors. These shared songs strengthened communities and preserved traditions that often lasted for generations. A guest book rested near the entrance. Many visitors had written short reflections rather than simply signing their names. "Thank you for preserving this peaceful place. My grandparents were married here in 1939. We drove 3 hours just to hear the bell ring again." Ethan smiled as he turned the pages. History was never far away. Outside the chapel, an elderly groundskeeper carefully trimmed a row of flowering dogwood trees. He paused long enough to greet Ethan. "Beautiful evening." "Certainly is." The groundskeeper looked across the valley. "Cared for this chapel for 28 years. He gently rested his hand on one of the old stone walls. "My father cared for it before me, and his father helped repair the roof after a storm back in the 1940s. Ethan admired the weathered stones. Each one had been placed by hand. Each one remained exactly where generations of builders intended. "Do many people still visit?" The groundskeeper smiled. "Every day. The ones who come." He looked toward the quiet chapel. "They're usually looking for the same thing." "What's that?" "A little peace." The words felt wonderfully simple, yet somehow they explained the entire journey from the rainy forest roads to the old inn, the schoolhouse, the mill, the bridges, the farms, the museum, and now this quiet chapel. Every stop had offered the same gentle gift, a reminder that history is not only about remembering the past, it is also about discovering the quiet places that continue to bring comfort in the present. As Ethan returned to the station wagon, the chapel bell rang once. Its clear tone floated across the valley, carried gently by the evening breeze. The sound faded slowly into the mountains, where it seemed to become part of the timeless landscape itself. The bell's gentle echo slowly faded into the evening air as Ethan continued his drive through the Appalachian countryside. The road descended from the ridge in long, graceful curves. Below, the valley glowed beneath the golden light of the setting sun. Every meadow seemed touched with amber. Every stream reflected the sky like polished glass. The mountains, so mysterious beneath the rain and fog only a day earlier, now stood proudly against the horizon, their ancient ridges glowing softly in the last light of day. Ethan smiled. The landscape had not changed, only the weather, and perhaps the traveler. Sometimes a journey changes the person more than the place. As he rounded another bend, Ethan noticed a large wooden sign beside the highway. Blue Ridge Scenic Railroad Museum next followed the narrow lane through a grove of towering white pines until an old brick roundhouse came into view. Its enormous wooden doors stood open. Several beautifully restored steam locomotives rested quietly inside, their polished brass fittings gleaming beneath warm overhead lights. Although silent now, they seemed full of life. Steam locomotives transformed America during the 19th century, shrinking travel times between distant cities and opening opportunities for commerce, migration, and exploration. Entire towns flourished because railroads connected farmers, factories, and families across thousands of miles. For many Americans, the whistle of a steam train became the sound of progress itself. Ethan wandered slowly through the museum. One locomotive had hauled passenger trains across the Appalachian Mountains during the early 1900s. Another had transported lumber from mountain forests to growing cities. A third carried soldiers during World War II before returning to peaceful civilian service after the war ended. Each engine had its own remarkable story. Nearby, an exhibit displayed vintage railroad uniforms, conductors' hats, pocket watches, lanterns, leather ticket punches. Everything had been carefully preserved by volunteers who believed ordinary history deserved extraordinary care. A retired railroad engineer happened to be guiding a small group of visitors. His calm voice echoed gently through the roundhouse. "When people think about railroads," he said, "they usually think about engines." He smiled warmly. But railroads were really about people. He pointed toward a faded photograph showing station workers standing proudly beside a train. Every trip depended on engineers, conductors, mechanics, telegraph operators, cooks, porters, track inspectors, and hundreds of others whose names rarely appeared in history books. Ethan quietly nodded. Once again, the journey reminded him that history is often built by ordinary people doing extraordinary work with quiet dedication. Outside the museum stood an old passenger coach, restored exactly as it had appeared in 1927, the polished wooden seats, brass luggage racks, large windows overlooking the mountains. Everything invited visitors to imagine another era. Ethan sat beside one of the windows. For a moment, he closed his eyes. He imagined families traveling home for Thanksgiving, children pressing their noses against the glass as mountains rolled past, college students returning for summer vacation, newly married couples beginning their first journey together. Each passenger carried hopes for tomorrow. Each left behind memories that quietly became part of America's story. As the museum prepared to close for the evening, Ethan stepped outside. The sky had turned shades of orange, pink, and lavender. A gentle breeze carried the scent of pine needles and warm cedar. Far away, almost too faint to hear, a real freight train sounded its evening whistle. The retired engineer smiled. Never get tired of that sound. Neither did Ethan, because after all the miles, all the rain, all the quiet roads, that whistle no longer sounded like a train alone. It sounded like history continuing its peaceful journey, 1 mile, 1 memory, and 1 generation at a time. The evening sky slowly deepened from soft lavender, to a rich shade of midnight blue as Ethan left the railroad museum behind. The station wagon followed a quiet two-lane highway that gently traced the curves of the mountains. The headlights illuminated only a short stretch of road ahead, while the rest of the landscape rested peacefully beneath a blanket of stars. There was no rush. There was nowhere he needed to be before morning. The journey itself had become the destination. After several peaceful miles, Ethan noticed a small roadside marker beside an old stone wall. Blue Ridge Wayside Rest, established 1938. He turned into the quiet picnic area. Several handcrafted wooden tables overlooked a wide valley where the lights of distant farmhouses twinkled like tiny stars scattered across the hills. The air was cool, fresh, wonderfully still. A nearby plaque explained the history of the overlook. It had been built during the late 1930s as part of a scenic highway improvement project, giving travelers a safe place to stop, stretch, and appreciate the remarkable beauty of the Appalachian Mountains. During the early 20th century, scenic overlooks became an important part of American road travel. Engineers and conservationists recognized that the journey itself could be just as meaningful as the destination. Carefully placed overlooks encouraged motorists to slow down, admire the landscape, and experience the natural beauty that made each region unique. Ethan sat at one of the weathered picnic tables. The wood had grown smooth from decades of visitors. Families had likely shared lunches here. Children had laughed while chasing butterflies. Couples had watched sunsets together. Retired travelers had unfolded paper maps across this very table while planning tomorrow's drive. Ordinary moments, quiet moments. The kind that rarely appear in newspapers, yet they become the memories people treasure most. Beside the overlook stood a stone drinking fountain fed by a natural mountain spring. The water was icy cold, crystal clear. Mountain springs have supplied clean drinking water to travelers for centuries. Long before bottled water became common, natural springs along wagon roads and early highways offered refreshing places where both people and horses could rest during long journeys. Many springs became familiar landmarks, remembered almost as fondly as the destinations themselves. Ethan cupped his hands beneath the flowing water. It tasted wonderfully fresh. He imagined generations of travelers doing exactly the same thing. A wagon driver in the 1840s, a family in a Model A Ford during the 1930s, a soldier returning home after World War II, a young couple on their honeymoon during the 1950s. Different lives, different dreams, the same cool spring. As darkness settled fully over the valley, thousands of stars filled the sky. Without the bright lights of large cities, the Milky Way stretched from one horizon to the other with breathtaking clarity. For countless generations, Americans living in rural communities relied upon the night sky not only for beauty, but also for practical guidance. Farmers observed seasonal constellations, sailors and explorers navigated by the stars, and families often gathered outdoors on warm evenings simply to admire the heavens above. The stars quietly connected every generation: native peoples, colonial settlers, railroad builders, teachers, farmers, travelers. Each looked upward and found the same sky waiting above them. Ethan leaned back against the picnic bench. The gentle breeze carried the scent of mountain laurel and pine. He closed his eyes for just a moment. The memory of rain still lingered, not as a storm, but as a peaceful beginning. Without that rainy morning and the soft curtain of fog, he might never have discovered the quiet roads, welcoming strangers, forgotten landmarks, and timeless stories that had transformed this simple drive into something unforgettable. Sometimes the longest journeys begin with nothing more than a rainy road, and a willingness to slow down enough to follow it. Dawn arrived quietly once again. The first light of morning gently washed over the Blue Ridge Mountains, turning the eastern sky into soft shades of pale gold and light blue. A delicate mist floated above the valleys, far thinner than the heavy fog that had welcomed Ethan at the beginning of his journey. It seemed almost familiar now, like an old friend returning to say good morning. Ethan awoke naturally. No alarm, no schedule, only the cheerful songs of American robins, northern cardinals, and eastern bluebirds greeting another peaceful day. He stepped outside the station wagon and stretched slowly. The mountain air felt cool against his face. Nearby, the spring continued flowing just as it had through countless mornings before this one. Nature never hurried. It simply continued. A narrow walking path led from the wayside rest toward a grassy hill overlooking the valley. Curious, Ethan followed it. At the top stood a simple wooden gazebo built by local volunteers. A small bronze plaque inside read, "Dedicated to the families who helped preserve this scenic highway, may future travelers find peace here." The words felt almost like a blessing. Scenic highways across the United States represent more than transportation routes. Many were carefully planned to protect breathtaking landscapes, historic communities, and natural landmarks, allowing travelers to experience America's beauty without sacrificing the character of the regions they passed through. Roads can connect cities, but scenic roads connect people with places. Ethan sat quietly beneath the gazebo. The morning sun slowly climbed above the ridges, sending golden light across the forest below. Tiny patches of mist drifted through the trees before quietly disappearing into the warming air. Watching them fade, Ethan thought back to the beginning of his drive. At first, the fog had hidden everything: the old mill, the schoolhouse, the covered bridges, the chapel, the museum, the farms, the friendly strangers. Every beautiful discovery had been waiting beyond the mist. Perhaps life often works the same way. Sometimes we cannot see what lies ahead, not because it isn't there, but because it simply hasn't revealed itself yet. History teaches this lesson again and again. Every generation faces uncertainty. Every generation continues moving forward, and eventually, the path becomes clear. A family of white-tailed deer quietly crossed the meadow below the hill. They paused for only a moment before disappearing into the forest. White-tailed deer have lived throughout the Appalachian region for thousands of years, adapting to changing forests, growing towns, and shifting seasons. Today they remain one of the most familiar and graceful animals in the eastern United States, reminding visitors that wildlife continues to thrive alongside human history. The peaceful scene lingered in Ethan's memory. He knew this journey was slowly approaching its final chapters, yet there was no sadness, only gratitude. Gratitude for the rain that had slowed him down, for the fog that had encouraged patience, for the quiet roads that had led him toward forgotten stories, for the ordinary people whose simple lives had quietly shaped the history of America. As he returned to the station wagon, the morning sunlight filled the valley completely. The fog had vanished. The mountains stood clear from one horizon to the other. The road stretched ahead beneath a bright blue sky, and somewhere beyond the next gentle curve, another peaceful story was already waiting. The station wagon rolled forward once again, its tires humming softly against the smooth pavement as the morning sunshine filled every corner of the valley. The rainstorm that had begun Ethan's adventure now seemed far away. Even the fog had become only a gentle memory. Yet both had quietly changed the way he looked at the world. The highway followed the course of the old river, winding through broad meadows where wildflowers danced in the light breeze. Along the shoreline, great blue herons stood perfectly still, patiently waiting in the shallow water, while turtles warmed themselves on smooth rocks beside the riverbank. Nature moved without hurry, without noise, without competition, simply following the rhythm it had known for thousands of years. Several miles later, Ethan noticed a brown National Historic Landmark sign. It pointed toward an old canal lock preserved beside the river. Curious as always, he turned onto the gravel road. Hidden beneath towering sycamores stood massive blocks of hand-cut limestone, arranged beside a quiet stretch of water. The canal itself was no longer used. Wild grasses now grew along its edges. Dragonflies skimmed peacefully across the still surface. Yet the lock remained remarkably well preserved. During the early 19th century, canals transformed transportation across much of the United States. Before railroads dominated long-distance travel, canals allowed heavy cargo such as timber, coal, grain, and iron to move efficiently between growing towns and major ports. Communities located along canal routes often prospered, becoming important centers of trade and industry. Building these waterways required extraordinary determination. Thousands of workers dug channels by hand. They carved stone, constructed locks, built aqueducts, and reshaped entire landscapes using little more than simple tools and relentless perseverance. Ethan rested his hand against one of the cool limestone walls. The stone still bore tiny marks left by chisels nearly 2 centuries earlier. Each mark represented someone's careful effort, someone whose name might now be forgotten, yet whose work continued to endure. History is often like that. Many of its greatest builders are remembered not through monuments, but through the lasting usefulness of what they created. A wooden footbridge crossed the old canal. Halfway across, Ethan stopped. The water below reflected drifting clouds and overhanging branches with almost perfect clarity. It was difficult to tell where the reflection ended and the real sky began. The peaceful silence invited him to remain there for several minutes. No traffic, no hurried footsteps, only birdsong echoing gently through the trees. Nearby, a historical marker displayed an old photograph taken around 1885. The same canal had once been busy with long, narrow boats pulled by mules walking patiently along the towpath. Families sometimes lived aboard those boats for weeks at a time, carrying goods from one community to another while traveling at little more than walking speed. Slow travel once defined America, and perhaps that slower pace allowed people to notice far more than speed ever could. As Ethan continued along the shaded towpath, he found an old wooden bench facing the quiet canal. Carved into its back were simple words: "Take only memories, leave only kindness." He smiled. Those words seemed to summarize everything the mountains had been teaching him since the first raindrops fell on Old Mountain Road. He sat for a while, listening to the gentle breeze rustle through the sycamore leaves overhead. Some journeys change where we go, others change how we see. This rainy drive beyond the fog had quietly done both, and as Ethan rose to continue toward the next peaceful chapter, the old canal remained behind, silent, timeless, and patiently carrying the reflections of another beautiful American morning. Leaving the old canal behind, Ethan returned to the scenic highway, where the landscape gradually began to change once again. The mountains became gentler, the valleys grew wider. Fields of corn and wheat stretched toward the horizon, their golden colors swaying softly beneath the warm afternoon breeze. The farther he traveled, the more Ethan realized that every region of America has its own quiet rhythm. The Appalachian Mountains spoke through mist, forests, and winding roads. The valleys answered with rivers, farms, and open skies. Neither was louder, neither was more important. Together, they told one continuous story. A few miles later, another historic marker caught Ethan's attention. Old Red Mill, bridge constructed 1903. The bridge crossed a broad river whose water moved slowly beneath graceful stone arches. Unlike the covered bridges he had visited before, this one was built entirely from hand-cut granite. Its solid construction reflected the craftsmanship of another era. Stone arch bridges became symbols of durability during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Engineers designed them to withstand floods, harsh winters, and decades of constant travel. Many continue carrying vehicles today, proving that careful craftsmanship can endure far beyond a single lifetime. Ethan parked near the bridge and walked to its center. The river below reflected the afternoon clouds as gently as polished glass. Several fishermen stood quietly along the shoreline. None appeared to be speaking. There was no need. Sometimes peaceful company requires very few words. Fishing has long been woven into the fabric of American life. For many families, it has never been only about catching fish. It is about patience, conversation, tradition, and spending time beside quiet waters where generations gather to slow down and reconnect with nature. One elderly fisherman noticed Ethan admiring the river. "Beautiful day," he said with an easy smile. "It certainly is." Man nodded toward the water. "My grandfather brought me here when I was 6. He chuckled softly. Now my grandson comes with me. 3 generations, the same river. The same peaceful tradition. History often survives not because it is written down, but because it is lovingly repeated. As Ethan continued across the bridge, he noticed small brass plaques set into the stone railing. Each carried the name of one of the local stonemasons who had helped build the bridge over 100 years ago. Their names were simple, ordinary, yet they had quietly become part of something extraordinary. Without realizing it, they had built a landmark that would welcome travelers for generations still to come. The afternoon breeze carried the scent of river water and wildflowers. High above, a flock of Canada geese crossed the blue sky in their familiar V-shaped formation. Every autumn, millions of migratory birds travel across North America, following routes that have existed for thousands of years. Long before roads, railroads, or maps, these ancient pathways connected lakes, rivers, forests, and coastlines, reminding us that nature has its own enduring history. Ethan watched until the birds disappeared into the distance. Then he smiled quietly. Every mile of this journey seemed to whisper the same gentle lesson. The greatest stories are rarely the loudest. They are found in places where rivers keep flowing, bridges keep standing, families keep returning. And history continues, one peaceful day at a time. With the warm afternoon sun guiding the road ahead, Ethan climbed back into the station wagon and continued driving toward another quiet horizon, where the next forgotten story patiently waited beyond the rolling hills. Late afternoon slowly melted into early evening as Ethan followed the scenic highway farther west. The sunlight had become softer than ever, wrapping the countryside in warm shades of honey and gold. Long shadows stretched across the fields, while gentle breezes moved through rows of corn like quiet waves upon a peaceful sea. The station wagon passed through a landscape that seemed untouched by hurry. An old red tractor rested beside a weathered barn. Laundry swayed gently on a clothesline behind a white farmhouse. Children chased fireflies near a split-rail fence while a golden retriever patiently watched from the front porch. Every scene felt wonderfully ordinary, and somehow, that made it extraordinary. History is often remembered through presidents, battles, and inventions. But the true rhythm of a nation is found in everyday life, in family dinners, in neighbors helping neighbors, in front porches where stories are shared as the sun slowly sets. After another gentle curve, Ethan noticed a narrow gravel road leading toward a small lakeside park. A wooden sign welcomed visitors. Liberty Lake Park, established 1926. He turned into the quiet entrance. The lake stretched peacefully before him, its calm surface reflecting the evening sky with remarkable clarity. A wooden dock extended into the water. Several empty rocking chairs overlooked the shoreline. Nearby stood a historic stone boathouse built from native fieldstone. The building blended so naturally into the landscape that it seemed as though it had always belonged there. During the early 20th century, community lakes and public parks became treasured gathering places across America. Families came to picnic, swim, fish, paddle canoes, and enjoy summer evenings together. Many parks were created to ensure that natural beauty remained accessible to everyone, regardless of where they lived. Ethan walked slowly onto the dock. The wooden planks were smooth beneath his boots, polished by decades of footsteps. He paused at the end. The water barely moved. Only the occasional ripple appeared when a fish gently disturbed the surface. Far across the lake, a loon called softly. Its haunting voice echoed across the still water before fading into the surrounding forest. The peaceful sound lingered long after it ended. Near the shoreline stood an old wooden canoe displayed beneath a protective shelter. A nearby plaque explained that it had belonged to a local park ranger who had spent more than 40 years caring for the lake and helping visitors safely explore its quiet coves. The canoe was beautifully preserved. Its cedar boards carried the rich color that only time can create. A simple paddle rested beside it. Nothing about the display felt grand, yet it quietly honored a lifetime of service. Sometimes history remembers famous names, other times it simply remembers faithful hearts. As Ethan sat in one of the empty rocking chairs, he watched the first hints of sunset spread across the western sky. Orange slowly blended into crimson. Crimson softened into pink. Pink faded gently toward lavender. Every color reflected perfectly across the still lake. The scene almost looked like a painting. He remembered something the elderly woman at Hawthorne Orchard had said. Always leave enough time to notice the orchards. Now he understood. She wasn't speaking only about orchards. She was speaking about life. Leave enough time to notice the bridges, the rivers, the quiet towns, the old depots, the museums, the family farms, the mountain roads after rain, because those are the places where history quietly lives. As evening settled over Liberty Lake, the rocking chair moved gently with the breeze. The water remained calm. The mountains rested peacefully beyond the trees. And Ethan knew that although this remarkable journey was slowly nearing its end, its quiet lessons would continue traveling with him long after the road itself disappeared beyond the horizon. The sun slipped quietly below the distant hills, leaving behind a sky painted in soft shades of rose, amber, and deep violet. Liberty Lake gradually settled into evening, and the first stars appeared one by one above the peaceful Appalachian landscape. Ethan remained in the rocking chair for a little while longer. There was no reason to rush. The gentle creak of the chair blended with the whisper of the breeze moving through the nearby pines. Somewhere across the lake, a small rowboat drifted slowly toward shore. Its lone fisherman raised a hand in greeting. Ethan returned the wave. No words were needed. Simple kindness has always been one of the quiet traditions found along America's back roads. Before leaving the park, Ethan walked one final time to the edge of the dock. The water had become so still that it reflected the stars almost perfectly. For a moment, it felt as though the sky existed both above him and beneath his feet. The view reminded him that perspective changes everything. What appears hidden during one season may become beautifully clear in another. As he drove away from the lake, the road gently climbed through another stretch of forest. Towering tulip poplars, white oaks, and eastern hemlocks lined both sides of the highway. The scent of pine filled the cool night air. Occasionally, tiny flashes of light appeared among the trees, fireflies. Their soft golden glow floated quietly through the darkness. Across much of the eastern United States, fireflies have long been a familiar part of warm summer evenings. Generations of children have watched them dance across fields and forests, turning ordinary nights into unforgettable memories. Though small, their gentle light has inspired stories, songs, and moments of wonder for centuries. Ethan slowed the station wagon. The forest looked almost magical. Hundreds of tiny lights blinked gently among the trees. Not bright, not overwhelming, just enough to remind anyone watching that nature often whispers instead of shouting. A few miles later, he reached a scenic pull-off overlooking the valley. The town he had visited the previous evening could be seen far below. Its courthouse clock tower was illuminated. Main Street glowed softly beneath vintage street lamps. The railroad depot stood quietly beside the tracks. From this distance, everything looked peaceful, connected, timeless. Ethan unfolded the old paper map once again. Its edges had become worn after days of careful use. Small creases crossed every fold. It no longer looked new, it looked traveled. Tucked inside the map was the postcard from Willow Creek General Store. The image of the fog-covered valley looked exactly as Ethan had first seen it. Below the photograph were the familiar words. Some places don't ask to be remembered, they simply never leave your heart. He smiled. The postcard had been right all along. History is not only preserved in books or museums. Sometimes it quietly settles into the heart of the traveler. It becomes part of how we see the world, how we appreciate ordinary mornings, how we notice old bridges, quiet rivers, weathered barns, and friendly strangers. The journey beyond the fog had never truly been about reaching a destination. It had been about learning to slow down, to notice, to listen, to remember. The stars grew brighter overhead as Ethan carefully folded the map and placed it back beside him. Tomorrow would bring another sunrise, another peaceful road, another chapter waiting somewhere beyond the hills. But tonight, the mountains rested beneath a sky full of stars. The forests whispered softly in the breeze. And the memories of one rainy drive continued to glow, as gently as the fireflies dancing through the Appalachian night. The following morning arrived with the same quiet grace that had defined every mile of Ethan's journey. A soft golden sunrise spread across the Appalachian Mountains, gently illuminating the forests, rivers, and rolling farmland that had become familiar companions over the past several days. The station wagon waited beneath an old maple tree. Its windshield carried tiny drops of morning dew that sparkled like crystal as the first sunlight touched them. Ethan brushed them away with a smile. The road ahead stretched peacefully toward the horizon. Yet this morning felt different, not because the landscape had changed, but because Ethan had. When he first entered these mountains, he had hoped to discover forgotten places. Instead, he had discovered a forgotten pace of life, one that measured time not by deadlines, but by sunrises, rainstorms, friendly conversations, church bells, train whistles, and quiet evenings beneath countless stars. As the engine started once more, the familiar sound felt almost comforting. The station wagon rolled slowly onto the empty road. Morning mist rested lightly over the fields. Cows grazed peacefully behind weathered wooden fences. A farmer waved from a distant tractor. Ethan raised his hand in return. Simple greetings have long been part of rural American culture. Along country roads, neighbors and travelers often acknowledge one another with a friendly wave, a small gesture that reflects hospitality, respect, and a shared appreciation for community. Sometimes history is preserved through traditions so ordinary, people hardly notice them. After several peaceful miles, Ethan reached the crest of a gentle hill. A large wooden overlook had been built there. Unlike the others he had visited, this one offered a view of nearly the entire valley. The river shimmered like a silver ribbon. Historic church steeples rose among clusters of trees. Covered bridges connected quiet roads far beyond them. Blue mountain ridges stretched toward the horizon in endless layers. Standing there, Ethan quietly realized something remarkable. Every place he had visited remained exactly where it had always been. The old mill still listened to the creek. The schoolhouse still watched over its hill. The chapel bell still welcomed peaceful evenings. The depot still faced the railroad tracks. The orchard still waited patiently for another harvest. The bridges still carried travelers across quiet rivers. The museum still protected ordinary memories. Nothing had asked to be discovered. Everything had simply waited. History often behaves that way. It does not chase us. It patiently waits until we are willing to slow down enough to notice it. A small bronze plaque stood near the overlook's railing. It carried a quotation from an early conservationist. Land remembers every generation. The question is whether each generation remembers the land. Ethan read the words twice, then a third time. They felt like the perfect reflection of his journey. Every road, every forest, every farm, every quiet town had remembered those who came before. Now it was his turn to remember them. He took one final deep breath of the cool mountain air, the scent of pine, fresh grass, morning dew, and distant wildflowers blended together into a fragrance he knew he would never forget. The station wagon rolled forward once again, not toward an ending, but toward another peaceful beginning. Because every road that teaches us to slow down quietly becomes part of who we are. And somewhere, beyond another gentle curve, beyond another peaceful sunrise, America's timeless history continued waiting, patiently, for the next traveler willing to follow the road beyond the fog. As the overlook disappeared in the rearview mirror, Ethan understood that every meaningful journey eventually reaches a point where the traveler stops counting miles and begins collecting moments. The road stretched peacefully before him. Fresh morning sunlight poured across the Appalachian foothills, turning fields of wildflowers into blankets of gold and blue. The air remained cool, carrying the earthy fragrance of damp soil left behind by the gentle rains that had started everything. The farther he drove, the quieter his thoughts became. Silence no longer felt empty. It felt full, full of memories, full of gratitude, full of stories that had quietly settled into his heart. Several miles later, Ethan noticed a weathered sign pointing toward a small historic cemetery attached to an early pioneer church. The sign simply read, "Pioneer Meeting House established 1816. He turned onto the narrow gravel lane. The white wooden church stood beneath towering bur oak trees, whose branches spread wide like protective arms over the peaceful grounds. Nearby rested a small cemetery where generations of local families had found their final resting place. Wildflowers bloomed between many of the old stones. Nothing felt neglected. Everything felt lovingly cared for. The morning breeze gently stirred the American flag standing beside the church entrance. Its quiet movement seemed to honor everyone who had once gathered there. Early meeting houses like this played an important role throughout the young United States. They often served not only as places of worship, but also as schools, voting locations, community gathering halls, and shelters during difficult times. In many frontier communities, one modest building became the center of daily life, bringing neighbors together through every season. Ethan quietly stepped inside. Sunlight streamed through clear glass windows, illuminating rows of handmade wooden pews polished by generations of careful hands. The room carried the comforting scent of old pine and beeswax. A single Bible rested upon the simple pulpit. Nothing seemed elaborate, yet everything felt meaningful. Sometimes history speaks most clearly through simplicity. Near the entrance hung a framed photograph taken during the church's bicentennial celebration. Children stood beside great-grandparents. Veterans stood beside teachers. Farmers beside firefighters. Families whose ancestors had worshipped there for nearly 200 years smiled proudly beneath the same roof. The continuity felt remarkable. Outside, Ethan noticed a young father walking slowly with his daughter among the old headstones. The little girl looked up and asked, "Did all these people really live here?" Her father smiled gently. "They did, because they cared for this place." He looked across the quiet valley. "We're able to enjoy it today." The little girl nodded thoughtfully before picking a fallen oak leaf from the grass. She carefully placed it beside one weathered stone, not as a decoration, simply as a quiet gesture of respect. Ethan smiled. History continues when one generation teaches the next to value what came before. As he returned to the station wagon, the church bell rang softly across the valley. 1, 2, 3 gentle chimes each echoed through the trees before fading into the peaceful countryside. He paused for one final look. The white church stood quietly beneath the ancient oaks. The flag moved gently in the breeze. The little girl still walked beside her father. Life continued exactly as it should. The road ahead remained long, but Ethan no longer wondered what he might discover next. He had learned the greatest lesson of all. Every quiet town, every peaceful valley, every forgotten building, every ordinary family is a living page in the endless story of America, waiting patiently to be remembered. The church gradually disappeared behind the tall oak trees as Ethan continued along the peaceful country road. The morning had fully awakened now. Sunlight spilled across wide meadows where wildflowers nodded gently in the breeze. Red-winged blackbirds perched on weathered fence posts, while a pair of horses grazed quietly beneath the shade of an ancient sycamore tree. Everything seemed to move with quiet purpose. Nothing seemed rushed. The farther Ethan traveled, the more he noticed small details that he might once have overlooked. An old stone well beside a farmhouse, a hand-painted sign advertising fresh peaches, a grandmother hanging quilts across a porch railing to catch the morning sunshine, a boy carefully helping his grandfather repair a wooden fence. These were not famous moments. They would never appear in national headlines. Yet they were the quiet moments from which America's story had always been built. History often remembers extraordinary events, but nations are sustained by ordinary days. After another peaceful mile, Ethan noticed a modest brick building with a white cupola rising above its roof. A sign near the entrance read, Willow County Public Library, founded 1912. He parked beneath a flowering dogwood and quietly stepped inside. The library was wonderfully calm. Tall wooden shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with books whose worn bindings reflected decades of careful reading. Sunlight poured through large windows, creating warm patches of light across polished oak floors. The faint scent of paper, leather, and old pine filled the air. Libraries have long been among the most treasured institutions in American communities. From small rural reading rooms to grand city libraries, they have offered free access to knowledge, encouraging curiosity, lifelong learning, and civic engagement. For generations, libraries have welcomed everyone equally, regardless of age or background. Near one corner stood a display titled, Stories of Willow County. Inside the glass case rested handwritten journals, early town newspapers, school yearbooks, family recipe books, and faded maps drawn by local surveyors more than a century ago. One journal belonged to a schoolteacher who had taught in the one-room schoolhouse Ethan had visited earlier in his journey. Its pages described snowy winters, spring wildflowers, harvest celebrations, and children whose eager questions filled the classroom each morning. Reading those quiet entries, Ethan realized something beautiful. History is often written one ordinary day at a time. No one wakes up believing today will someday become history. Yet eventually, every sunrise does. An elderly librarian noticed Ethan studying the exhibit. She smiled warmly. "We're not only protecting books. What are you protecting?" Ethan asked. She looked around the peaceful room. "Hope." He tilted his head slightly. She continued. "Every book reminds us that people before us faced difficult days, joyful days, uncertain days, and kept moving forward." She gently closed one of the display journals. "That's a hopeful thing to remember." The words lingered in Ethan's thoughts long after he thanked her. Outside, the courthouse clock from the nearby town chimed softly across the morning air. Children's laughter drifted from a neighborhood playground. Somewhere down the street, a bakery opened its doors, filling the breeze with the comforting aroma of fresh bread and cinnamon rolls. Life continued peacefully, exactly as it had for generations. Ethan returned to the station wagon and unfolded the old paper map one more time. Its folds were now soft with use. The postcard from Willow Creek still rested safely inside. The handwritten notes from the innkeeper remained just as they had on the first rainy morning. Only one blank space remained near the bottom of the map. Without thinking very much, Ethan borrowed a pencil from the dashboard and quietly wrote his own sentence beneath the others. "Road beyond the fog was never searching for me. It was patiently waiting until I learned how to slow down enough to find it." He smiled gently, folded the map once again, and placed it beside him. The engine started. The road stretched peacefully ahead, and beneath another bright Appalachian sky, the quiet journey continued. The road carried Ethan through one final stretch of rolling countryside, where the Blue Ridge Mountains slowly faded into the distance behind him. The landscape became broader. The valleys opened into gentle farmland. Wooden barns gave way to quiet villages, and the winding mountain roads gradually straightened into peaceful country highways. Nothing happened suddenly. Just as the journey had unfolded one gentle mile at a time, the mountains quietly released their traveler. Ethan glanced once in the rearview mirror. The highest ridges were now softened by distance. A faint ribbon of morning mist still rested among the peaks. For a brief moment, the mountains looked exactly as they had on that first rainy morning. The fog had returned, not to hide the road, but almost as if to say goodbye. He smiled. "Some places never ask us to stay forever. They simply hope we leave a little different than when we arrived." The station wagon crossed one final stone bridge. Willow Creek flowed beneath it with the same calm rhythm Ethan had listened to days before. The water had not changed. The forests had not changed. The mountains had not changed. The traveler had. He no longer hurried past old buildings. He no longer overlooked quiet country roads. He no longer believed history belonged only inside museums or textbooks. He understood now that history lives wherever ordinary people care for one another, preserve their communities, and pass simple traditions from one generation to the next. That realization felt like the greatest souvenir he could possibly carry home. Late in the morning, Ethan reached the small inn where the journey had begun. The familiar porch still overlooked the valley. Flower boxes beneath the windows overflowed with bright geraniums. Wind chimes swayed gently beneath the roof, producing the same soft melody that had welcomed him on the rainy afternoon of his arrival. The elderly innkeeper was watering flowers near the entrance. He looked up, smiled warmly, and tipped his hat. "I had a feeling you'd be back." Ethan laughed softly. "Think you knew I wasn't finished?" Innkeeper nodded. Mountains usually decide that. They sat together on the wooden porch overlooking the valley. Neither man spoke for several minutes. They simply listened. A breeze moving through the trees, birds singing in the distance, the quiet murmur of the creek below. Finally, the innkeeper asked, "So, you find what you were looking for?" Ethan thought carefully before answering. "When I arrived, I thought I was looking for history." He looked across the peaceful landscape. "But I think I was really looking for peace." The innkeeper smiled as though he had heard those words many times before. Funny thing about these mountains. They've been giving people both for a very long time. Two men shared a quiet laugh. The sun climbed a little higher. The valley shimmered beneath its warm light. Somewhere far away, a church bell rang once. Then everything became peaceful again. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and removed the old paper map. He carefully folded it one final time. It was no longer just a map. It had become part of the journey itself. The innkeeper accepted it gently. Leave it for the next traveler. Ethan smiled. I hope they take the slow road. Innkeeper looked toward the distant mountains where a thin ribbon of mist still floated between the trees. I hope they do too. For beyond every quiet bend, beyond every gentle rain, beyond every curtain of fog, another timeless American story was patiently waiting for someone willing to slow down, listen. And remember, the following morning, Ethan loaded the last of his belongings into the station wagon. The suitcase rested in the back. His favorite travel mug sat in the cup holder. The dashboard looked almost empty without the old paper map that had accompanied him throughout the journey. For a brief moment, he simply stood beside the car, looking across the quiet valley. The rain had long since passed. The fog had lifted. The mountains stood clear beneath a brilliant blue American sky. They looked exactly as mountains should, ancient, patient, unchanging. The innkeeper stepped onto the porch carrying two steaming mugs of coffee. He handed one to Ethan. Neither man spoke immediately. Some farewells are most meaningful when accompanied by silence. After a few peaceful minutes, the innkeeper smiled. You know, watched travelers come and go for nearly 40 years. Ethan looked at him. Most remember the scenery. Some remember the roads. Few remember the history. He paused, watching a pair of swallows glide above the valley. But the happiest ones, they remember how this place made them feel. Ethan quietly nodded. He understood exactly what the old man meant. Places leave photographs in our cameras, but they leave peace in our hearts. That kind of memory lasts much longer. The two shook hands, a firm handshake, simple, sincere. One final gesture before another journey began. Ethan climbed into the station wagon. The engine started with its familiar gentle hum. As he slowly drove down the gravel driveway, he looked once in the rearview mirror. The innkeeper stood on the porch, raising one hand in farewell. The flower boxes still overflowed with color. The wind chimes continued their quiet melody. And beyond them, the Blue Ridge Mountains rested peacefully beneath the morning sun. They did not seem to say goodbye. They simply remained, waiting patiently for whoever might arrive next. Hours later, the mountains gradually disappeared behind the distant horizon. Busy highways eventually replaced winding country roads. Traffic became heavier. Billboards appeared once again. Cities slowly returned. Life resumed its familiar pace. Yet something inside Ethan remained wonderfully unchanged. Whenever traffic slowed, he felt no frustration. Whenever rain began falling against the windshield, he smiled. Whenever he crossed an old bridge or noticed a weathered farmhouse beside a country road, he looked a little longer. The journey had quietly taught him that every place has a story, every community has memories. Every generation leaves gentle footprints for the next. Years later, whenever friends asked about his favorite road trip, Ethan never spoke first about famous landmarks. Instead, he remembered the rain falling softly through ancient forests, the forgotten grist mill beside the creek, the one-room schoolhouse, the quiet chapel, the covered bridges, the old railroad depot, the family orchard, the peaceful library, the historic canal, the friendly waves from strangers along country roads, and the wise innkeeper who had simply handed him an old paper map on a rainy afternoon. Because sometimes, the greatest journeys are not measured in miles. They are measured in moments of quiet wonder, and sometimes, the most unforgettable destination is not a place on any map. It is the peaceful version of ourselves we discover when we finally choose the slow road beyond